Oh, hi. I've never done this before, so I don't know. Don't really know how to do it. So hopefully, you guys show me. I guess. Oh, I like this 10x guy. He seems like a solid programmer. Something about just something about his name. I think.
What's up, dude?
Hey, bro. What's up,
My first question is, how much are you benching in prison?
dude? I couldn't. I can't lift the bar. What are you talking about?
What? Come on, dude.
I was busy in prison. People think prison is like you just work out and you don't do anything else. Like you actually that's just not how it works. Like I was really, really busy. I was working real hard. So prison was
Oh
just
yeah, I was actually gonna ask you last time you were on. I forgot to ask this. What are the top three things you read? Because I know you were talking about how you were reading a bunch of research papers and other things. I'm just curious if you have a list.
yeah. I'm gonna put out a list of the best books I read. I thought Petzold's Code was really good. Um, I can't say like I personally learned a lot or anything, but in terms of like the best book I read in prison, I think that was it. I don't know if you've ever read it.
No, I haven't. I'm
So
gonna try it out though.
yeah, so he's a ex Microsoft guy, I think, and he also read he also wrote a guide to sorry, I'm just adding speakers and stuff, so I'm a little distracted. He wrote a what would he call it? It was like a guide or a tour, a guided tour to Turing's paper, his on computable numbers paper. So that's sort of like the sequel to Code. Um, so it was a pretty good. It basically code. What the good thing about Code is it takes you from like binary circuits and numbers to all the way to like how modern computers built. So he kind of like shows how gates are built and how like why floating point exists and stuff like that. So he really like it's the first book I've ever seen that actually shows you like how computers really work on a very very like physical level. So I thought it was a beautiful book. Like he goes in a lot of kind of discursive different directions. So again, I read 300 or 400 books in prison. I thought that was like the most like probably kind of best one for people to read. I think I obviously know how gates work and stuff like that, but it's just still was cool to sort of see the way he did it and what the stories that he told were pretty cool.
Yeah, that's huge, man. I feel like, the modern style is to learn some high level language and just kind of take everything for granted and go out and do some stuff. But, it's good to learn things from the bottom. I
Right.
think it's how you truly understand things.
Yeah, he goes from like flat. The story starts with you have a next door neighbor and you're a kid and you're flashing a flashlight to communicate in the middle of the night while your parents are asleep, and you start by drawing letters on each other's walls, and you realize it's really cumbersome. So you go to Morse code, and then he sort of talks about how Morse and Braille are binary codes. Braille being sort of super interesting. That if you think about it, it's a binary, in essence, a binary code. It's just a six-digit, right? Binary touch-based messaging system, and then he sort of talks all about binary, and then he goes into like octal or even like a four base four number system, which was really funny. I think he used a duck for that or a bird or some kind, and he keeps building and keeps building, and then eventually he gets to okay, like how do we make a machine add and subtract, and then how do we make a machine store information, and then he gets to instruction sets and stuff like that, and again something every assembler person probably you know knows how to do. There's another book I really wanted to read in prison, but I didn't get a chance. It's called like the Black Book of Assembler or like something like that. It's like some amazing assembler book, but I never got a chance to read that. One other one that was really cool from history is 100 Basic Games. Digital Equipment Corporation wrote this in 1977, I think. And if anybody knows the story, Elon Musk had a video game published when he was like 10 or 11 in some Australian magazine. I really want to see that. Like, I want to see how what he did as a kid. But he published a game. I think it was like 1,000 lines of code or something. So if anybody's got a copy of Elon Musk's game that he published in
Right.
as a teenager,
Yeah, I think actually someone turned it into like JavaScript and uploaded it somewhere
that's awesome.
online. I think you could Google it and find it. It's pretty cool.
That's so cool.
It's
Yeah,
called Blastar.
yeah. I think he was like, oh yeah, what was it called?
It's called Blastar.
Yeah, that's it. That's what it was called. Yeah, it's in his book, Ashley Vance's book, which was actually pretty good. It looks like a weird dime store, like kind of bizarre, like little book, but it's actually a seriously researched book. And I think Walter Isaacson is working on a book about Elon Musk as we speak, which I think is almost like not a good thing if you're Elon. It's kind of I don't know, like he's taking his bow as the world's richest dude or whatever, and like it's probably not the position I'd want to be in if I were him. Like Walter Isaacson's probably the kiss of death. You know, there's just like a little bit of I don't know, bad luck that comes with like, you know, you I'm sure you may have heard of like the Business Week cover Kiss of Death. It's like a great contrary indicator if you're ever on the cover of Business Week. It's like, yeah, that's the worst thing ever basically. Almost everybody who gets that soon will soon fall off pretty quickly. So, but anyway,
I guess Elon must not be very superstitious then.
right. He was on the cover recently, and I think his stock was probably double what it is now. And then you know it's funny because Bezos was on the cover in 2000, and Walter Isaacson himself picked Bezos as the person of the year in 2000, and Amazon's obviously done really amazing since then. So it's not foolproof, but it's always a little bit like you know whenever I was in the financial industry, if you ever saw somebody like on a bus or on a billboard or something, you're like, oh, that's got to be the top, you know. Once you see crypto as a headline, it's like, oh boy, you know. I mean, I for instance believe that when the Wall Street Journal starts regularly quoting the Bitcoin price, that's probably a good time to sell. Like they still don't do it, which is hilarious because it's a bigger asset class than some of the stuff they quote regularly. So, you know, at some point they're going to start quoting crypto regularly, and that's probably going to be a good time for it to fail. So anyway, 10x. Just to finish some of those questions, I think Code was really good. Then I picked a fiction book, and I almost never read fiction in prison, but I really enjoyed The Three Body Problem by Shizhen Liu. And I don't like science fiction either, so I typically hate the genre. But Shizhen Liu's Three Body Problem, which is a 3-book series about the future, it's being turned into a film by Netflix, so I really look forward to that. It was a beautiful book. Really transcended the genre. Shizhen Liu was a true literary master. Like it felt like reading Shakespeare or something. It had so many interesting literary devices. Like he had stories within stories. He had all kinds of interesting allegorical arcs that had, you know, some had to do with science fiction, some didn't, and it was really neat to see, you know, kind of a strong writer first and foremost, and science fiction and all that kind of later. But he dealt with things like the future and aliens and all kinds of, you know, fun sciencey stuff. And he really felt like reading a scientist. Like one of the reasons I hate science fiction is science fact is often more interesting than science fiction. So, you know, there's plenty of things to digest. Like I'd rather read Nature or, you know, Science or whatever, Cell, every week than read some science fiction book. You know, especially if it's not a modern science fiction book. Like reading Asimov is kind of like, okay, you know, it's not that great. I will say, like Philip Dick was a tremendous author, but you know, anyway, point being, that series is probably my number 2 favorite book. And then there was this book called, I guess I'll throw in a business book. I read a lot of books in prison, but so it's hard to pick 3. But one really great business book was The History of the Future. It's by Blake Harris. It's about how Oculus started and the path Oculus took to its sale at Facebook, and it's sort of the I guess, you know, the closing of that and kind of what happened next. and just going through the Palmer Luckey story, and just kind of how the whole VR world was kind of turned upside down pretty quickly by a very, very unlikely 19-year-old. Kind of really an amazing story that should give everyone some confidence that you can do it too. He just took that love of one little area, VR, that had been basically abandoned, and turned it into just like a one-man force for success, and didn't have any commercial instincts at all. He wanted to give it away at first. Somebody had to talk him into not doing that. Somebody had to talk him not to take a job at Sony, and the guy hasn't really changed. He's still an anime guy. He's still he's a cosplay person. To me, that's the best life you can live, is to be authentic. I think cosplay is for dorks, and anime too, but that's just me. um, you know, but if you like something, yeah, I like right wing politics. Okay, so if that's unpopular, I'm still gonna like it, and whatever it is, just to be honest with yourself and not change for other people. I think that's one of the hardest things to do, especially as a successful person or as a business person. And Palmer really was unapologetic about who he is, and I think that's awesome. You had something to say, Quinn? Maybe not.
Hi, Martin. Actually, speaking of VR and Palmer Luckey and Oculus and all that, I was curious to hear if you've tried some of the newer VR headsets, because they're actually getting pretty compelling recently.
I'm sure they are. I haven't been able to. I asked. I'm getting to see my sister tomorrow, so I hope she has the latest Quest. I had one of the very, very, very first Oculuses with the software developer kit. I promised to make a golf video game, I believe, in order to secure one of those bad boys. So I really loved it, and immediately offered to invest $1 to $10 million at any valuation. I think I still have the email somewhere. It's pretty funny. Um, I was like, I don't have anything to do with software or virtual reality, but I really want to invest. And I didn't get a chance to. The VCs scooped up before I could, but it was I was in there at the very, very, very beginning. I think I was, maybe a couple months into it, sort of the Kickstarter they started, but I got in pretty early, and certainly have not tried anything since then. But I'm really looking forward to it. What's up, K-Bar?
Hi, Enrique. So there's a subject I have not heard you address since you emerged from the clink that you must have an opinion on, I feel, as a Wall Street bets legend, and that is GameStop.
Yeah. I think GameStop is one of these things where they have to build it and they'll come, and that's sort of the hard part. I was actually joking about this on Telegram earlier. If your stock goes up too much, you end up in a bad situation as a manager, where and I think Warren Buffett has talked about this. And if you want to just jump on mute for a second, just while I give you my long-winded answer, because it's going to be long-winded. I don't want to hear too much noise in the background. Or I'll just mute you, you bastard. I'm kidding. So anyway, the basic problem is when your stock goes up, you have to deliver now, right? So let's say your market cap was 300 million, and you had a conference call where you expressed a lot of confidence, and then all of a sudden your market cap 600 million. Well, now you're screwed, right? Because now you have to earn twice as much money that maybe Wall Street thought you were going to earn in the long run or whatever. Now, maybe Wall Street just didn't realize how much money you were going to earn in the first place. But assuming nothing changed from Monday to Tuesday, and assuming your valuation was fair at 300 million, you've just kind of created a problem for yourself, right? The first acquisition I did as a public company CEO, our stock went from 10 to 30. And it was kind of an issue, because now anybody who bought the stock at 30, and obviously you may know, whenever a trade happens, it means somebody bought and somebody sold. So somebody's buying at 30, and then 29, and then 28, and it's going down because ultimately I didn't come up with a plan to triple the value of the company. I would love to, but it's not easy. So I think the problem with GameStop is the stock went up a lot. And now, what do you do as the CEO of the company? You have to actually create so much value. It's basically becomes impossible. So if somebody, quote unquote, moons your stock, it actually is a really bad thing, because your expectations are so damn high that you just can never meet them. Now your cost of capital is a lot lower, which is good, right? You can sell stock, you can do a secondary, you can kind of try to to backfit into it. But this company was like a full professionally run company at $4 or $5 a share. So at $130 a share, it's like, can we really create a company 40 times more valuable than we thought we had? That's really hard to do, even if you have the wind at your back, right? And you have like all the trends going in your direction. It's impossible to do from like a standing start. And I wish the guy the best of luck, obviously. But if it were me, I wouldn't want to buy the stock.
Okay, so all right, so that's all fair enough. But I feel like maybe you don't fully appreciate what the GameStop thesis is, uh, right? Like the GameStop trades at 130 not because anybody thinks that the company per se is 26 times more valuable than it was five, but because there is a belief among, and this is really what I'm asking about, but there's a belief among thousands of people, which I'm mostly agnostic about, but a lot of people have bet a lot of money on it, that they have that more shares of GameStop have been sold than exist, and they've spent the last two
Yeah,
years trying to flush those out
yeah, yeah.
and prove their thesis.
No,
So,
so I'm kind of, you know, I don't want to call myself an OG because there are certainly people older, smarter, and richer. But when it comes to this kind of stuff, I think I'm a relative OG, at least to Wall Street Bets. I've been around the short seller block for a long time. I used to short sell for a
well, right.
living. So
No, I
like,
know. That's
yeah,
why
yeah,
I'm very interested in your opinion on the
this is
matter.
my cup of
Like,
tea. Like, I love this
so
stuff.
is it the basically either it's they're right or they're not. Like it comes down to either there's a mass like delusion. People are
Well,
like in an echo chamber, or there really are more shares sold than
well,
exists.
I don't know that it's 100% binary. I think it could be one or the other. I don't think, but I think it could be a little bit of both. So, like, obviously, there's people putting buying pressure on the stock that are sort of out for blood on a short squeeze. And then there's obviously short sellers that are kind of nervous about when are these guys going to give up. So that dynamic is pretty tense, and that's what makes a market all the time, right? That's what happened to Tesla. It's what happened to Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, which was famously shorted, that did fine. Um, and in biotech, there are countless companies that I've shorted that are in a similar dynamic. So I think that game in the long run kind of plays its course. Kind of like more or less solves itself. Like ultimately, unless the earnings show up, the long guys kind of get tired. If the earnings look bad for GameStop, the average Wall Streeter, at least, I'm not saying the average Wall Street better, that's different. But the average Wall Street firm is like, yeah, I don't want to play this game anymore. Like it was at 130, earnings look bad, I'm out of here. Because in 5 years, like this disequilibrium of longs and shorts will disappear, and all that will be left is what is this company worth. So this is sort of like a game being played in the market. It's kind of like the game of chicken in game theory, right? It's which side will swerve to the left or to the right, or will the cars crash, or will both cars swerve, right? And I think that the good thing about markets is that these things tend to generally be pretty fair. I think that the bad thing about markets is that they're not perfect. They usually tend to be pretty fair. And in the 1900s, there were a number of very well-heeled investors who began to do what the GameStop people or the Wall Street Bets people have done, which is that they started to quote unquote corner stocks. And corner meant that they would basically buy up all the shares. And there were short sellers back then, and they got kind of wrecked or whatever you want to call it, the Wall Street Bets Melvin Capital. And so what ended up happening is the SEC kind of came around and said, listen, if you're going to buy more than 5% of a company, you got to disclose that. Now, the funny thing about that is that worked really well. And then there started to be people who kind of violated that law and said, well, me and Amanda, well, we own 5%, we own 4.9% each. So together we own 9.8%. But we're not going to tell anybody because the threshold is 5%. So, as long as she keeps it quiet and I keep it quiet, we're going to be all right. And we secretly own 10% of the company. So some people do that, or some people did that. That typically isn't a good idea. Anyway, anytime you try to trick the government, it usually ends up backfiring. So anyway, the next thing that sort of ended up happening is this sort of distributed corner, which is kind of what the Wall Street Bets phenomenon is. And it's the
Right.
first time it's ever happened, which is
Right.
just really fascinating because it's supposed to be illegal. I missed one, which is the Nelson Peltz Silver Corner. The Peltz
Yeah,
brothers,
the silver.
not Peltz. I'm sorry. What am I crazy?
Hunt.
Nelson Hunt. The
Yeah.
Hunt brothers cornered. They bought 10% of all the silver in the world or more. I forget exactly. And the CFTC and Paul Volcker actually had to change the holding rules for futures in silver. So silver prices went up a ton. They were actually the richest people in the world for a minute. Then they regulated it so that you couldn't own that much of a single contract. And that's why to this day there are contract limits for any future or option. And so they're very, very large. But if you wanted to buy like 300,000 call options of the S&P 500, you couldn't do it in one single issue, which is interesting. So I think it's even in the tens of thousands for equities. But any event, the ability to corner a stock and manipulate it thus is basically been regulated away. Now the thing about Wall Street Bets is if you go on there and you say everybody buy GameStop and nobody lend it out and nobody do this and nobody do that, yes, you can distort and fuck up a market, and we've seen that for the last couple of years that it's persisted, which is probably the most surprising thing. It's not hard to corner a market for a day or for a couple of hours, but the fact that this thing has kind of held up for several years is sort of shocking.
And you
um,
know about the direct registration effort, right? That they have 13 million shares now directly registered, which precludes them from being loaned
sure.
out.
Yeah,
So
like as the CEO of a few different publicly traded companies, there is a really fascinating thing you learn when you get into the real nuts and bolts of the stock market. You can have this sort of DWAC or non-DWAC form stock. So there's nothing wrong with you asking your broker, "Hey, I want a certificate for my stock." That's right. I literally want like a piece of paper that is not tradable that I own this stock. And if you do that, nobody can short your stock and you could just leave it in a drawer for 10, 20, 50, 100 years. There's always that old trope about finding your grandma's stock certificates of AT&T in an attic somewhere and they're worth $50 million. That rarely ever happens, of course, but you can actually get a stock certificate instead of getting an electronically traded stock. And of course, why would you go backwards? Most people don't understand that the brokers let you lend your shares out, or the brokers lend your shares out. They usually don't pay you what they're getting for them. They pay you a fraction of that, and then whoever they're lending it to gets to bet against your stock, which most people kind of don't like that idea. Now, at the same token, you do get some fees, so people like that part of it. So, in any event, the GameStop thing is fascinating. I don't think in the long run that a cabal of kind of traders, big or small, can really distort the price of a security so much so that they ignore the value of the underlying business. Because I think there would have to be a willful delusion. Right now, there's a delusion, but it's more of a gamble that this new CEO and this new owner and the new management team, everything can turn around the company and make it great. That may happen. They may not happen. Again, I would not be betting that that would happen because it's fairly rare that you can actually do something like that. No matter how good your track record is, it's going to be pretty tough for this company to be worth 10 billion or whatever the market cap is. Now, at the same time, I wouldn't be like rushing to bet against it. The only question is, in a couple of years, which is usually the amount of time this kind of thing takes, if the strategy has clearly failed, the stock will drop. If the strategy has clearly worked, the problem I have is like the stock's probably not going to go up because it's already implied that it would go up. So like to me, it's not a good buy. And I think trying to like prove out the microstructure of the market that it actually like the short seller phenomenon exists or doesn't exist, like there are better things to do with your money than worry about are these shorts cheating or are they not cheating or this or that. Like who cares? At the end of the day, like if it gets your rocks off, like fighting the big guy, so to speak, or like the really big traders like Melvin or whomever, then go ahead, knock yourself out. But to me, like I get my rocks off by making great returns. Like that's
yeah,
that's the job of investor. I think some people kind of like want to gamble with the stock market and see if they can abuse it and try to like, and that's why the SEC just came out. I thought it was a disgusting thing they put out where they basically were like, don't bet on meme stocks. And it's like,
yeah.
who are you to say what's a meme stock and what isn't? That's not, the SEC's business.
You're definitely right about that, though. That tons of people are motivated by like something akin to revenge. Like they feel
yeah,
like they've been playing us for so long, and now we're going to
yeah.
get to play them.
It's a mix of revenge and then it's also a mix of hacking. Like people think, oh, I can hack the stock market this way. Like,
Yeah,
these short
yeah,
sellers are like caught in a trap, and by buying the stock, I can kind of like fuck them up by like, basically like kick them while they're down. or rob them. And okay, like try it. It's not my job to try. Like, I think my job is to, and I know hedge funds that do this kind of thing. By the way, if they know that some hedge fund is going broke and they have to sell a position, they'll short that stock. If they know some futures trader is going broke and he has to buy a bunch of stock, they'll buy it first, or buy a bunch of futures. They'll buy it first before he can do it, so that they can liquidate. So we saw this recently with that crazy family office that blew up with the Tiger guy.
Oh
Um,
yeah, Arc
Archegos,
whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
with Bill Long, and to add insult to injury, they arrested him too. So I hope he gets. I hope he gets. I don't find it funny. I hope he gets acquitted.
No,
Acquitted because it's
it's
such
only
a.
funny in the sense of the absurdity of it. Like,
It
the
is
guy went
absurd.
from like $20 billion, and 2 days later he's looking at cuffs, I guess. So that's a tough day.
It is tough to lose all your money very in like 3 days, but at the same time, and then get arrested a few weeks later. But uh, and he comes from the same hedge fund sort of gang that I do, and Gabe did, which is the Tiger world. So it's too bad. I think he's probably a good dude, but just kind of flew too close to the sun, and whatever. Anyway, who else wants to talk?
Hey, Enrique.
Hi.
Hey, I'm Quinn. Huge fan.
Great.
I run a Christian trading and SPAC leaks group, and we wanted to get your thoughts on circumcision. Are you for or against, and your thoughts on the societal and medical reasons for it?
Well, I'm certainly no expert, and I just X'd somebody out who wanted to speak. So if you want to speak, there's one spot pending, or one spot open. So yeah, I'm not. This isn't my wheelhouse. I think in general, I think the consensus is that circumcision is beneficial. Societally, it obviously seems like a little cruel and a little painful, but I think ultimately the evidence hasn't shown that like there's a kind of like a psychosocial effect on the child's too young to remember it. So that's the best I got for you. I hope that helps. Anybody else? And feel free to step down and let somebody else grab your spot.
Hi, Enrique.
Okay.
All right. Hey, I was just wanting to ask you, like, with your case, do you think you were like set up, or do you think you would deserve to catch some kind of punishment? And do you think the punishment was too harsh?
Can you repeat your question? Your thick Australian is boggles my
Scott,
American
Scottish,
mind.
mate. Right. So, see the punishment you got for
Oh,
when you went to jail. Do you think that was too harsh? And
yeah,
do you think you were set up?
it's a good question. So basically, the question is, was my punishment too harsh? Is that basically
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Yeah. So I think so. Like, and I'm not saying that because it's me. I'm trying to abstract, myself out of this. Because otherwise, of course, everyone would say that their punishment was too harsh and I shouldn't have done a day in prison. But I'm not going to be that sort of person. Try to be at least a little intellectually honest. I mean, I think that everybody's punishment right now is probably a little too harsh. One of the things that I think the judicial system doesn't understand is that once you get a felony, you're sort of branded with this, at least in our country, you have a permanent kind of scarlet letter that makes employment, banking, all types of, even voting, and forget gun ownership. That's off the table for forever. All of those things become really, really difficult. And so the time served is actually not the hardest thing. The time is actually pretty easy. Don't let my powers that be hear me say that. But I'm being tongue in cheek. The time is relatively easy depending on the time you get, because ultimately what you do in prison is you read, you watch TV, your food is paid for, your stay is paid for, you don't pay taxes, you just kind of lounge around, play cards, tell jokes, work out. It's not really the worst thing in the world. I think the worst thing in the world is more the other side, which is like, okay, now you're a felon, you're kind of going to be mistrusted. There's a bunch of people that sort of don't understand how punitive that is for yourself and your family. There was some like total weirdo in the NFT group. This guy got arrested for $40,000 NFT kind of front running the other day, and there was some idiot. Like I really was trying hard not to go crazy and scream at her. she was like, I hope he gets all 40 years. He's going to get 40 years. And I'm like, it's such an ignorant perspective. Like, he's not going to get 40 years. He's going to get like a year and a day. It's just not enough money to get you a serious amount of time. That's more or less how the time thing works. You get sentenced based on how much money you stole or lost or whatever. So, um, but I think people sort of just like they don't anthropomorphize or empathize or do any of those things when they think about a big number like 40 years. It's a long time. Um, that's your whole life basically. So, you know,
Do you think like you were set up as a kind of political prosecution, and who do you think was out to get you if you do?
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think that. You know, I think that the better question isn't necessarily that. I think the better question is why is our country so like excited and interested to prosecute people and fill jails up? I think that we have, several. I mean, we have 3 million people or so in prison across state and fed. We have 200,000 people in the federal system. We have 4 times as much imprisonment than most of the rest of the world, like Europe and so forth. We have a 99% conviction rate. It's like it sort of like feels like a business to some extent. It sort of feels like a weird system. Like 25% of black males will go to prison at some point in their life. I mean, if you think that's like normal, I think you need your head checked. Like that's not normal. That's crazy. I think that we need to sort of adjust that. I don't know how, that's past my pay grade, but I do think like we've had this crazy overzealous prosecution. To answer your question more directly, like take a look at the Operation Varsity Blues, which is where they grabbed a whole bunch of like rich parents who tried to get their kids into colleges. Like this is an FBI operation. Like, is the Federal Bureau of Investigation's time best served like trying to stop people from cheating on SATs? Like, I think that's nuts. Like how is that even like a thing? You're talking about like arresting somebody. They always bring like 20 people with guns because like you're trying to get your kid into Harvard and you paid somebody some money in a briefcase. Look, that's wrong. It's illegal too. But sending that person to jail and consuming our tax dollars for that, I mean, at the end of the day, if you know any of these rich kids, typically like uh, they go to these good schools, they end up like not doing well, and like no amount of money can like turn an idiot into a successful person. Like I've seen it myself on Wall Street and stuff like that. Like your dad or mom can be whoever you want. Like it's just not going to work in the long run if you are an idiot yourself and you don't know anything. Like the kid from Brooklyn, which is where I'm from, but the kid from whatever city is who, if he's smart, or the gal, she's smart and she works hard, and like that person that has all those family connections, quote unquote, they're not going to go anywhere. Like if you look at the richest people on the Forbes list right now, very, very few of them had important parents. Most of them were just working class people. So at the end of the day, like that problem takes care of itself. The FBI didn't need to go like arrest 80 people to worry about cheating on tests and stuff like that. And then they do all kinds of like weird and stupid prosecutions like that. I think they don't have much time. They have too much time on their hands, I should say. And it's like, yeah, it's sort of silly. So I think we have a lot of prosecutions. I wouldn't call them political. I would just call them like vendettas. Like I don't think they're like some secret, person who's pulling the puppet strings. That's like Hillary Clinton or somebody who's like, yeah, get this guy. I think it's more like you have a ton of people with a ton of time on their hands. And the funny thing about the government is, unlike business, they never downsize. So they just always kind of like grow and grow and grow and grow. And you never hear about like, oh, there's layoffs at the FBI or there's layoffs at the CIA. No, it's like, no, more people, please. And the government's the biggest employer in our country, so it's this big bureaucracy, and they just need people to pick on. I guess that's my impression as somebody who's been through it.
Well, I'm glad you're out. Thanks, mate.
Thanks. Anybody else? Go ahead, Swarthy.
Hey, yeah, how you doing, Enrique?
Well,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about kind of the situation we have going on with deep tech funding, especially in the United States with DARPA, IARPA, et cetera. Do you think, and maybe your background in pharmaceuticals has a perspective on this, do you think we need some kind of reform, or how do we handle the problem of funding deep tech without expecting capital returns on a 10 or 20-year time scale?
okay, so your question is like when it comes to projects like DARPA, like moonshots and like basically like Manhattan Project. How do you do that successfully?
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think our country's done it okay, because most other countries don't even do it. I think that, NIH is probably one of the better organizations. I don't think they're good, mind you, necessarily, but I think they're probably, they probably do more than other countries. So can you make it better? Yeah, probably. Like we have this thing called InQtel. If you don't not familiar with it, it's like the CIA's venture capital group. That's pretty cool. I mean, just the fact that DARPA exists is really awesome. One of the nice books I recently read just a few months ago in prison was A History of AI by Niels Nilsson. I forget the exact title of it, but it's by Niels Nilsson, who is one of the Stanford AI kind of luminaries. And he actually walks through all the DARPA kind of efforts, the early DARPA efforts that gave birth to quite a lot of AI, frankly. And we all know the DARPA and ARPANET and stuff like that. But in any event, I think that you know, it's really tricky. Like the biggest thing we need, I think, is probably something like that in Alzheimer's. And I think government has kind of been wise to sort of not step on industry toes too much. But like Alzheimer's is one situation where we have a health catastrophe kind of looming, and our population is aging, and millions of people, maybe even tens of millions of people, will get Alzheimer's disease, which is a really forget about the social and medical impact. It's just a really expensive problem too, and you're going to have a lot of people who are not going to be very productive, who are going to require round the clock care, and we have no clue what causes Alzheimer's disease or how to treat it, which is really unacceptable because it's going to be a catastrophe. And so one of the problems is patent life only lasts 17 to 20 years. So drug companies don't have too much incentive to kind of try to do try to make a drug where you might have to intervene like when a patient is 40 so they don't get Alzheimer's when they're 60. That may or may not be how the disease works. It could be more temporally kind of soon than that. But I think that some people believe at least that the seeds of Alzheimer's start pretty early, and they're just sort of, you go in this slow decline. We all know that Alzheimer's does take time to go from MCI, so-called mild cognitive impairment, to mild Alzheimer's to moderate to kind of severe dementia. So it'll be interesting to see if we sort of tackle something like that, where we actually do need really serious investment. And then you have things like quantum computing, right? Where does it make sense for our country, for defense reasons alone, to sort of be the quantum computer leader and compete with industry? Now, I don't like, as a libertarian, I really dislike the idea of government ever competing with industry, right? But at the same time, like, there's sort of defense priorities and other strategic priorities, like Alzheimer's, for example, is sort of theoretically kind of a strategic defense kind of platform. I mean, you don't want not half, but you don't want a quarter of your country or 10% of your country senile, if you can help it. So there's a lot of problems that I think government has a role to play in, because they're the only operator at scale that can waste 5 or 10 or 20 or $30 billion, and it doesn't matter. I don't want them. I'd rather they not be involved, right? But I'd rather the markets take care of it. But we just spent 30 or 40 $1 billion assisting Ukraine, which again is probably worthy money spent. But all I'm saying is, I think spending that money on an Alzheimer's cure, or at least a clue to cure Alzheimer's, would be really cool. Perkins, did you want to go?
Yeah, hi, Shkreli.
Hey.
I have a two-part question. The first part is I noticed that your bio mentions that you're into software development now, and I was curious if that was something you kind of always dabbled in, or maybe you kind of decided to transition while you were serving time. And then the second part is, can you talk at all about what you're working on now in relation to software development, and if not, maybe just the broader category of
Sure.
that?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So as a kid, I actually was pretty certain I was going to be just a developer, software engineer as an adult. I mean, that was my life's goal. I did mostly work in like some of the older '90s languages, some of which are dead now. But that was my goal, and I sort of got into just by happenstance kind of got into the stock market. It was around the time of the dot-com bubble, so there were companies going public left and right, and I sort of convinced my father to make some investments. I kind of got into that a little bit, and then I got a job at a hedge fund as a teenager, which allowed me to sort of really run with that. I was sort of came from a family where I didn't want to take the risk of doing what I loved, uh, and throw away a chance to like get a foot in the door in Wall Street. In retrospect, I would have done what I loved, but I don't regret too much, what I did. So I went to Wall Street and I didn't really look back. I focused on biopharma. I had an interest in all things kind of STEM. The Human Genome Project was also getting completed around that time. So for me, I was really fascinated by medicine and by biology as well as computer science. So for me, it wasn't that big of a leap. So I kind of I guess forgot about software for a little bit. I did work at tech hedge funds and I did do a little software research, so it wasn't completely lost. But I stopped programming for sure. And I've never like done too much of like production level serious software development. I did get a taste of it in 2016 and 2017 when I started a software company. So I've been dabbling in it on and off. Emotionally, it's sort of always been very close to me. And certainly, some things like being a CEO and starting some very successful companies, I've been able to accrue a lot of like management skills and different things like that. Like at the end of the day, building a software company is about talent. It's about hiring people smarter than you, people you would work for. As Mark Zuckerberg says, the best interview question is, would I work for this person? And everyone I've worked with in software, I would clean the floors of their office. So I'm really lucky to have met some really smart, really, really smart programmers that I adore and I look up to. And, they're not just good programmers, they're good people too, which matters a ton. So I love software. I am going to be releasing some computational chemistry software fairly soon. So that's software that calculates whether a molecule may or may not be a good sort of binder to a medicine or to a protein, but therefore it may or may not be a good medicine. This is pretty traditional software that's very difficult to access at the moment. It's very difficult to use. So I'm hoping to create something that democratizes that sort of very expensive, very gate-kept process, and come out with that fairly soon. And then I have a couple other projects, which I'll talk about when they're ready. But, that's sort of the first one out of the hopper, which I did write a paper about computational chemistry while in prison for COVID-19. And again, if something like the software I'm envisioning was actually out at the time, which it wasn't, I think there could have been a more democratic and crowd-sourced sort of COVID drug. But unfortunately, this sort of software is kept behind very, very tight, expensive gatekeepers only for the biggest pharmaceutical companies and only for the biggest academics. So hopefully in 3 or 6 months, you'll be able to do your own drug discovery right from your computer or phone. Again, that doesn't mean that you'll be able to make a cure for any disease you wish. Far from it. It's a very laborious, long, difficult, expensive process. But that first little itty bitty step of taking a computer and designing a drug with it, I think we can make that more or less free and democratic for everyone. So that's sort of what I'm up to, at least a portion of what I'm up to. Some of those are tools that we already sort of were building and had before I went to prison or during. So in essence, it's a project that it's sort of the it's not finalization, but it's sort of the continuation of a project we were already doing. So hope that helps. If you don't mind stepping down, we've got a lot of people who want to chat. Hash
Hey,
Hash
Enrique.
and 10x. You're always
I'm
welcome to
gonna,
jump
yeah,
in.
I was gonna say it's good talking to you again. I actually have to run, so I'm gonna give my spot to somebody else, maybe, or feel free to pick somebody. But
All right.
hey, man, see ya.
Yeah, I'll promote Hash to co-speaker. Cool. See you later, man.
Sounds
And
good.
there's some room. So yeah, go ahead, Chairman, if you'd like.
Yeah, I actually had a question for you. I was reading your blog and I noticed you briefly talked about um, large scale language models. And I was wondering if you had a chance to play around with the GPT-3 or any other language model and see what you think about them.
Yeah, so I just added you to co-host. If you want to come up and co-host, feel free to accept or decline as you see fit. So yeah, LLMs are indisputably the future, right? Like this is the maybe most important invention next to the blockchain next to the internet. Like, I can't understate how cool LMMs are. So if anybody in the chat hasn't had the experience or hasn't learned about them, you will be learning about them whether you like it or not at some point in the future. I think that basically science, not to be dramatic, has created a machine that can almost mimic human understanding, which is really scary and surreal. There's an article about GPT-3, which you mentioned in the New York Times, which talks about the interviewer from the New York Times, the reporter, basically getting a very deep dive into OpenAI, which is the company that sort of developed GPT-3. Now, Google has a similar large language model, and Facebook has one as well, and God knows who else has them. And maybe they're even better than OpenAI's. We just don't know yet. But I think that we're going to see a huge, huge, huge shift in all of software, and how we communicate with computers and communicate with each other, how we create art, how we create language. All of those things are going to change a lot in the next sort of 5 to 10 years because of this. I'm surprised they haven't changed more quickly, to be honest. And I think part of that is OpenAI has been really hesitant to allow you to use this software. So there's another open source project that is sort of being more democratic about it, and just opening it up for everybody. It's not quite as good as OpenAI's quite yet, I think, but I think it's called Elysium. You can correct me if I have that wrong. I maybe forgotten a syllable there, but it's something like Elysium. And OpenAI is
Luther AI.
Eluther. Thank you. I always mix it up with the another project. So Eluther is what it's called. And in any event, this is such a remarkable thing because it almost simulates creativity. And it's clear that the machine is doing something more than any other of these sort of mathematical models has done before. And there's a great article about this in Quanta, which is probably the best scientific writing you can find on the internet or anywhere. Quanta is funded by the James Simons Foundation. So it's a non-for-profit, but it's also like just they get the very best people to write the very best stuff on science and math today, and from a real practitioner's perspective. So it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but they also explain some of the most complicated things in very simple terms. So you don't have to be a scientist to read it. So anyway, they talked about how do LMMs actually do what they do, and they've come up with a few. The field has come up with a few ideas as to how could this possibly be happening, because it's such a surreal thing. It really does feel alive, and I think the biggest question we have to answer as a species is: Are machines mimicking us, or are we just machines? Right? There's this duality of it's really remarkable to see a machine get very close to human like, but then it's also kind of disappointing that, oh man, are we just a big math formula basically? And I think most scientists in this field, even in neuroscience and philosophy and all these other fields, computer science of course, basically feel that way, that our brain is just wetware and there isn't a whole lot to it, and that at the rate of progress, especially after you play with OpenAI's products, which a lot of which are not available to the public, but you can figure out a way to get GPT-3. You can figure out a way to get their product called Dolly. You can figure out a way to get their Copilot coder, basically automated coder, so you can use it to help you write a computer program. They have a suite of tools. I think they even have one for music. So they have a suite of tools that sort of uses these really interesting AI models, and their competitor includes Google and Google's sort of subsidiary DeepMind and some other companies and different divisions of big companies. So I do think we're at the cusp of sort of asking ourselves, why would we even do a Google search anymore? If you had a fully capable GPT-3, I don't think you need Google. And we're all doing Google searches every day, probably dozens of them, right? So GPT-3, you can actually ask it a question like, well, what's the best restaurant in New York that I haven't tried yet? Instead of doing this tedious kind of search and thinking about it, it'll give you 5 suggestions. Where should I eat tonight? What should I do tomorrow? All of those things, it'll give you an actual answer like a human would. And it's really a strange and remarkable phenomenon. And if you've ever talked to Transformer, the T in GPT stands for Transformer, try to find a way. I think there's a website where you can do it. There was one called talktotransformer.com. I think it was even GPT-2, and I was still stunned by it. So Try it out if you can. If you can't, read the articles where people have tried it out and see how it's responded. And again, you'll get like a chill down your spine, I think, when you realize how lifelike this thing is. Like, what do you think, Hash?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, first of all, like, I think you touched on a lot of like really awesome points that I would love to circle back to in a bit. But I mean, I personally have had like a lot of experience with playing around with the GPT-2 models back in the a few years ago, and more recently, I've been just playing around with GPT-3 so much. And as you said, it's like the more you, the more you kind of like, I don't know, get to know it, right? Like as if you would kind of like get to know a person. Um, it's not like you're not thinking like, oh man, this machine is so like so human. Like you basically just think like, oh crap, like we're all machines. Is what I mean. That's just how good it is. I feel like.
That's funny. All right. Anybody else want to jump in? Go ahead, Chairman.
Hey, Shkreli. I know you were in jail during this, but do you have any thoughts about the whole GameStop Wall Street Bets movement?
Yeah, I spent like 20 minutes on that like half an hour ago, so you missed it. But the TLDR is, I think that the short squeeze basically is a temporary thing. It's lasted longer than I think anybody's expected. I think that ultimately the company does have to deliver on, earnings growth and things like that. And in the long run, that's kind of what matters. In the short run, it's more of like a video game or a game theory game where, who is the stronger willpower, who is the, kind of incentive to win, will matter. But in the long run, no matter what, the earnings are going to be kind of what matters. And that could be still 2 or 3 years from now. I mean, this whole thing has lasted probably a year or two longer than most people thought it would. So, but ultimately, it's hard for it to feed on itself. Like there has to be some reckoning with whether the company actually succeeds in turning itself around or whether the company fails to turn itself around. That's what matters, I think, in the long run. And I don't like playing games with the stock market. Is the other kind of part I mentioned. Like it seems to me like this is more of a like having fun and trying to manipulate the market and trying to like test it, and that's sort of like not to me like a good use of time. Like it may very well be that a whole bunch of people can like corner a stock and make it go to $1 million a share. Sure, maybe. Um, but to me, like that's not a systematic skill that I want to cultivate. Like I want to cultivate a true long-term investing talent, not like a game we can play every now and then that's kind of crazy and nutty and never's been done before. Like that to me isn't like I don't want to be the first guy into battle on something like that. I'd rather just sort of sit back and watch it. It's kind of hard to see that be something that's like useful. At least I don't know if that helps.
Fair enough. Are you buying the dip right now?
So I'm a private equity guy. Like ultimately, trading isn't something that I do too much of. I think there are a lot of attractive stocks, but there's still a lot of shorts, and I don't like beta in general. So, to me, beta is a really hard thing to predict. Like obviously the market's down, and it seems to be more attractive, but like some of the prices are the same they were, a year or two ago. So that doesn't like this isn't a generational moment to buy stocks. Like it's some stocks are pretty attractive. Like I think Roblox in terms of tech, and there's certainly some biotech stocks that are really attractive. But there's still stocks that are shorts. Like I think Visa and Mastercard are good shorts. So like yeah, I think you have to balance kind of your beta. If you're all beta, I think you're basically just at the whims of kind of like a roller coaster, and you might succeed, riding that roller coaster, and you might not. But like investing talent to me is finding the best companies and benefiting from their stock price appreciation, and finding the worst companies and benefiting from their stock price depreciation. So that's kind of the way I look at beta. I've never met somebody that can reliably pick beta and reliably say the market's going up or the market's going down. So to me, buying a dip is like kind of a misnomer or like not an idea I am good at. I'm sure there are people that can do it. I just not for me. Who else wants to talk? Just jump on it. Go ahead, Argos.
Hi. What do you think about projects like DeepMind's AlphaFold that are using large neural nets to generate like medically interesting genetic sequences or protein folding. Like
Yeah.
I don't have a bio background, but I imagine you could use similar tech to the language models to generate genetic sequences the same way they generate characters.
Yeah, exactly. It's a brave new world. AlphaFold changed everything. I don't think there's a scientist out there that thinks. I mean, I've talked to a few people that think it's not going to be everything to everyone, which is probably true of all technology. But for the average X-ray crystal, AlphaFold seems to outperform, or at least get very close to the real McCoy, which is traditionally what you do is you take a protein, you try to crystallize it, may or may not form a crystal very easily. Once you've crystallized it, you shoot X-rays at it. Based on how those X-rays bounce off the crystal, you calculate what shape this protein folds into. So the primary structure is easy to determine. That's just an amino acid sequence. But how it actually folds based on kind of the relative attractions and repulsions of amino acids in the protein will change how that three-dimensional structure looks like, and that heretofore has been impossible to predict. So now it's predictable thanks to DeepMind, at least most of the time, right? It's not like 100% perfect, and I think that there's disordered regions of proteins that are impossible to predict. Basically, there's proteins that just won't crystallize. There's a lot of mystery still, but I think it's a massive step forward. And can you use the rest of the fruits of technology for bioinformatics? I mean, absolutely. There's um, the LLM part is really weird and funny because like I've thought about this myself. It's obviously a little fanciful to what you just said. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think like could you possibly predict function from sequence or function from structure? You're starting to get to a point where you can think about a synthetic life or designing synthetic life using a model, which again I think we're a little far from, and that's a little fanciful, but never say never. I mean, if you take amino acid sequences, which are just strings to a programmer, right? They're just strings. They're long strings, but they're all on PubMed. If you want to go play around with NCBI's database at nih.gov, PubMed, just Google PubMed, and you'll get there. There's things called blast sequences and stuff like that. You can just copy paste them. There's probably an API you can create, and using some amount of reinforcement learning, you might be able to sort of predict what would be useful or not useful. And it's kind of a scary thing. It's a little bit like I don't know, like synthetic engineering of living things is a very sort of fraught with kind of questions, right? Could you make a super virus? Could you make a superhuman? All of those things, kind of ethical questions, come to mind, and I think we've learned that I'm not the best person for ethical questions. So, just a little tongue in cheek there, but I do think like we have some time to think about this. Ultimately, no matter what we use, like in terms of X-ray crystals or in terms of what we're talking about here with LMMs to sort of think about new proteins, we still have this big bottleneck, which is actually taking this stuff from a machine in silico and turning it into a real thing is not like a trivial matter. Like proteins need to get expressed in some host system. That host system has to secrete them correctly. That once these get secreted, you have to do some tests on them. All that stuff costs a lot of money. So pressing some buttons on a computer, and I'm trivializing it intentionally here for a second because relative to the biological, lab work, wet work part of it, wet lab part of it, it's easy and fun to do in silico work. And then when the rubber hits the road and you actually have to express proteins and create real biology, real life, it's a lot harder. So I think it'll be fun to see what comes next. I'm not smart enough to be the guy that takes an AlphaFold size leap. I wish I was that intelligent. Maybe somebody here is. I'd love to hear about it. But that leap was such a big leap. And again, in retrospect, like all big leaps, it seems obvious, right? Ethereum virtual machine seems obvious in retrospect. So like that big leap that the people at DeepMind took, I wish I thought of it, and a lot of people probably did, and the next thing that happens, we'll say the same thing over. So I'm just here to sort of watch it and have fun, and if I can come up with something like that, very unlikely, but that'd be great. But my job is just to be the humble watcher of the stuff and try to squeeze a dollar or two out of it here and there. So I hope that helps. I know a few people had their hands up, so Mike maybe, or
Hey, Martin. Thanks.
hey.
Curious if you're familiar with the concept of self-sovereign identity and in general what your thoughts are on digital identity and where the space is going, and specifically maybe to your area of expertise, vaccine passports and how those are going to be or might be implemented and the risks there. And I mean, I'm against it, but just curious what you think or where that thing is going to net out.
Yeah, so many awesome questions and totally outside of my area of expertise. So I always want to like caution that my conviction in things that I don't know a lot about is usually very low. So, there's only a few things I think I'm an expert in, and this isn't one of them. There's a funny story from jail that I'll tell you really quickly. There's sort of a scam slash conspiracy theory in prison called sovereign citizen, and basically it is somewhere between a chain letter slash Ponzi scheme or whatever pyramid scheme to like a delusional sort of conspiratorial concept. And basically it goes like this: oh, what are you in here for, Mike? Oh, you're in here for murder. Okay, that's nice. Well, what are you in here for, Martin? Well, I'm in here for fraud, but I'm a sovereign citizen, so I'm just going to tell the judge that the U.S. rules don't apply to me, and I'm going to be walking out of that door in 2 weeks. And it's very like mean because as a prisoner, you're sort of sitting there like, gosh, I wish I could go home. And when people do this, it's and believe it or not, it sort of has this weird viral meme effect in prison. So people do this and say it all the time, and some people sort of start to believe in it, and it spins into all kinds of crazy. I almost want to write a book about it because it's fascinating. So it spins into all kinds of crazy sort of directions where there's this conspiracy theory that your social security number is actually a bank account number, and that your bank account, that there's all this money waiting for you that the U.S. government took out in your name. So again, all this is sort of silly. And I've had more than one conversation, probably more than a dozen, trying to debunk this stuff to guys in prison. But there is this deep desire to not want to be a part of a government authority, right? This idea that why can't I make my rules? Why can't I be sovereign? And to some extent, I wonder if that's sort of the direction you're asking, because I just had to mention the jail stuff. But when you say self-sovereignty, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a fascinating story. So I actually, we live in a society, we live in a trusted society. We're lucky enough to be in a place like the United States or Canada or whatever. I mean, self-sovereign identity is a concept that's been developed over the last decade or so. Specifically, it's based on, 3 decades worth of cryptographic research, and it's the whole concept of you can own your digital identity and how you present yourself to the world. So I can own my data, I can own my relationships. And self-sovereign identity also then expands into this idea of verifiable credentials. So, for example, the state of New York could issue you a driver's license that's connected to your identity. Then, when you go to the bank and you sign up for an account, you can say, "Hey, I am Martin. Here's my identity. And by the way, the state of New York has signed this certificate, the verifiable credential, and this is my driver's license." So it's a discipline. It's called self-sovereign identity. I recommend everybody check it out. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a very competitive space with all these digital wallets, and you can design it in a privacy preserving way, or it can be that these third parties just own and control the identity. I don't know if you filed taxes this year, but the IRS tried pushing ID.me this year, and that's an identity provider, but that's centralized. It's not a self-sovereign identity, and there was a lot of pushback, and people ended up winning, and the IRS dropped them. And of course, Apple and Google is going to try to be like, hey, have your identity under us. But given cryptography, given asymmetric keys, you could own your identity and those relationships. But nonetheless, like we're still in a legal system where we depend on the state, we depend on the courts, and so forth. So I'm not totally like separating from the state. We live in a good state. But yeah, I recommend you kind of look more into that. But of course, like vaccine passports, in my opinion, are dangerous, and you can get really scary stuff when it comes to surveillance and obviously like the intelligence agencies and so forth, these black hole of budgets. Anyway, I'm not now I'm digressing, but that's the general overview.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with like WorldCoin and Proof of Humanity, and like I think there's a bunch of other systems. Polygon has one. Like, so I'm familiar with the concept of just sort of like proving you're you and trying to control and own that. And I think that's cool. I mean, everybody should be able to do that, right? But I guess you still have this question of like, well, what good is it if that's the best you can do? Because ultimately, you're still sort of, I think, and I agree with most of what you said in terms of we have a good state, we're in a good place. Um, but it's funny. Like if you ever do get arrested, the FBI takes your DNA, which is really interesting. Which again, maybe they have the right to do that, and that's great. But it does make you wonder, like how are these databases getting built? What access do we have to them? What rights do we have to our own data? That's a question that people have progressively been asking, and I just don't know. It's sort of, again, not something I'm an expert in. It's sort of past my pay grade. I advocate every time for freedom and every time for autonomous freedom. I'm really disgusted by Letitia James' effort now to ban Bitcoin mining, which is pretty close to banning Bitcoin, if you ask me. They're different, but to me, there's a big sort of part of that that's the same, and that's New York State. That's not a small state. It's one of the bigger states in our country. It's one of certainly bigger economic engines in the world, and we actually do have a bunch of Bitcoin miners in the state. And say what you will about energy and things like that, but you're sort of to some extent banning freedom. And I think every step we take in that direction, we're taking a step towards, egotistical, megalomaniac gatekeepers who want less sovereign, less sort of a populace that's less free. And people have to sort of wake up and say something, because it's the only way that we'll elect. You get the government you deserve, I think. And you know, I do think that whether it's the IRS or some other part of the government, whether they have good intentions or bad intentions, states sort of tend to grow in this Leviathan type of manner where they do control a lot and end up getting corrupt and things like that. And so I don't think Trump's necessarily the answer, but I also think that, it's certainly a symptom of people wanting to be more free and getting sick of politics and getting sick of the chicanery that comes with it. So, I think that step today by the aspiring governor, Attorney General Letitia James, was the wrong step in the wrong direction and probably will backfire. And I hope it does. So anyway, that's about all I have to say on that. I think Posh wanted to say something.
Hey, Enrique. I'm a big fan of your work, especially your latest El Nuevo de Rey de Reggaeton album. Big
Thank
fan. But I just wanted to ask you a couple questions. So you're seeing like all of these, people that are big in Silicon Valley, like a lot of people that I personally respect and, in many ways look up to. For example, Elon Musk saying that he has a very quote unquote bad feeling about the economy, with 10% layoffs at Tesla. Y Combinator, a big accelerator here in Silicon Valley, is telling their companies to brace for a very conservative investing environment and to basically cut all unnecessary burn and just brace themselves for impact. Hardly any investors are willing to invest in this market. Coinbase is stopping all of their hiring. They're literally resending offer letters. And you have this entire kind of sentiment in the tech world, and I think in a lot of the markets in general, that the world is ending. I'm reading posts that are like even more doomy and gloomy than that, just by like anonymous people on the internet, like you know the coming recession is going to be unbelievably brutal. You will literally question every single assumption you've ever made about society. Everything you take for granted will come into the spotlight. You're going to realize how fragile the modern world actually is, how much of the wealth, quote unquote, we have is actually fake, how little you actually are worth when the United States government stops propping you up in the global economy. This will be the return to the mean dump of the first world living standards to the rest of the globe's living standards. It's going to be so bad that I get stomach pains just thinking about it. The Fed can't save us in time. And, a lot of this kind of sentiment coming out. And then yet I'm also kind of seeing the opposite. Some people are taking the opposite stance. Like, for example, Andreessen Horowitz recently announced a $4.5 billion crypto fund, more than doubling the size of their previous fund. And they're kind of like, the only people really, offering potentially a more optimistic view in the crypto space. And I'm personally working here in crypto and in a crypto startup, mind you. So, all of this language really impacts me and kind of where I'm thinking in like the medium to long term. And I guess I just wanted like your thoughts on all of this. You have a take.
Yeah, very depressing. I was Googling how to slit my wrists during that. So, but I don't think it's that bad. I think that it's normal for there to be a business cycle, and I think like a lot of financial people thought about like abstracting out the business cycle, that capital flows will never be subject again to greed and fear, and greed and fear are not going away. We have greed and fear. We've had greed and fear for a long time. We talked a little bit about biology earlier. Genes just don't change that fast. Like humans are basically been the same for 2,000 or even much longer than that. As a matter of fact, But yeah, we haven't had enough generations go by where greed and fear are going to disappear or even get better. Like, they may even get worse before they get better. So people who make real decisions, right, are subject to these moments of euphoria where they want to buy a Bored Ape for $200,000, and then at the same time, 3 months later, they think the world is ending. And I think, like, that's sort of just, if that's not greed and fear in a nutshell, then I don't know what is, right? Like, the same people may, be on private jets pontificating that the end is near. I think for the average Joe, like, the most important thing is just getting a solid education, working at a company that you really believe in, and continuing to learn and be productive. And America has one of the most productive societies ever, right? We got our whole country and bringing the whole world along with it interested in distributed ledger technology. If you told me ever that the whole country and the world would be interested in cryptography and sort of software development, I'd be shocked, right? And that's what's happened. And I think that we've led that charge, and we'll continue to lead that charge as long as our government doesn't get in the way. So software is productivity. I told that to a friend today, that, like, at the end of the day, there's only one way for an economy to grow. It's through productivity, and or at least that's the main way for it to grow, without population growth. So we've had enormous productivity gains in this country thanks to Microsoft, thanks to Apple, thanks to other companies like that. And I think crypto will unleash even greater productivity. The noise in between, like over printing of money, causing inflation, which causes the Feds to raise rate, which causes demand destruction, which causes all kinds of knock-on effects. All that's going to happen, and I think it'll happen for the whole world. But our country seems to get stronger every time, and I think, like, other countries that aren't as nimble or aren't as intelligent or have as many ingenious people, like our melting pot happens to have, I think those countries get hurt harder in these cycles. Like, if you look at France, which doesn't have a tech company to speak of, like, they don't have a protocol or a blockchain to speak of. They don't have anything. They've got expensive fashion and wine, and that's about it. And a country like that is in trouble, right? Our country isn't. So we may have a bad recession. It may clean out some of the excess. We may not. I don't know. I think it's very hard. I've never met somebody that could predict recessions, like, and how bad they would get, very easily. We may already be in a recession, which is unlikely, but unemployment's so damn low. So I don't know is the short answer for that, but I do think, like, we'll recover a lot better than anybody else. I do worry about our spending and our debt and stuff like that. I don't think that's, I do think we need politicians that are a little more sensible. But I've also talked to politicians that think that our national debt isn't as much of a problem as maybe it looks. And I buy some of that thesis and I don't buy some of it. So I do think we should clean up our balance sheet a little bit and be a little more austere about needlessly spending money. And obviously, the good news is that we're not too crazy on spending. If you look at sort of 3/4 of our budget is on stuff that you really can't cancel, like entitlements that we've grown quite fond of, like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. So, a lot of people complain about our deficit, but it really isn't, I think, necessarily on the spending side. It could be on the taxation side, which, again, I'm not a big fan of taxes myself. So it's a really tough conundrum if you're the powers that be in our government to try to decide how to balance a budget and keep us healthy, because ultimately, when you can't service your debt, that's when you go broke. And you do that, you definitely, more companies go bankrupt in a recession. And my bigger worry is that our country goes bankrupt in a recession. So I'm not trying to be a doomsayer. Like I said, our credit is impeccable relative to the rest of the world. But you did make a good point, which is all of that can change in a flash. Like, there are plenty of countries in the history of the world that seemed on top and seemed to have their stuff together and then very quickly plummeted. So I think we have to be vigilant. And again, we have some really brilliant people in our country that, is the envy of the world. I mean, some of the greatest inventions, some of the greatest thoughts, art, everything happens in America. And, I'm proud to be a part of it. Even though I have some other feelings about the government some days, I'm still, like, very proud to be an American patriot. And I do think, making this a friendly place for this next, sort of generation of technology, like I think the Winklevoss twins said in a recent introduction to a book called Crypto Dad by CFTC regulator Giancarlo. They said that we have to make sure that crypto comes to America and stays in America. And I think, again, not to beat up too much of my political opponent, but I think the New York AG ruling or whatever has been proffered up is a mistake, and that we don't want crypto to disappear to the Caribbean or to someplace in Europe or someplace in Asia that is letting the stuff take place. Because you saw Sam Bankman move over to the Bahamas, and again, why isn't his headquarters in New York? That's something that America should be worried about. We don't want to scare jobs, scare industry, scare productivity to other territories. That's a surefire way for America to go the way of France and those other European countries that aren't doing so. Max, did you want to talk?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about what you think of the concept of post-authorship. And I think it's a concept a lot of programmers are familiar with. They're always stealing or borrowing each other's code. But do you think that concept is going to grow in other areas, fields, and just in general? And then I guess another way of framing it would be like Pepe. Nobody really cares who made Pepe. People just use it, copy it, distribute it. And what do you think of you think of that concept?
Yeah, it's certainly been a trend, right? Like that's something I've actually wrestled with recently. I was thinking about copyrights and kind of willful violation of them and kind of the ultimate, result. I won't go into too much more detail, but I do think like you have a lot of these things that are like presumed to be open source. Memes are one of them. I think the idea that somebody wants to sue you over using your meme is a little ridiculous, right? But or copywriting a meme or something like that. But um, I guess I think if it's important enough for a brand to exist and like have copyrights and do all that, like they'll get them. And if it's not important enough, like a meme or Pepe, then you're not going to care anyway. And like you should just be happy that your thing became popular. I think that was like the attitude of a lot of the punk rockers and rappers and folks like that I always respected and listened to growing up. Like I used to go to concerts, and one of my favorite rock singers used to be like, "Well, buy the CD if you can afford it, but if you can't, steal that shit." And then they would jump into a song, and I'd be like, have a smile on my face because like, here's a band that really can't afford, they probably need every record sold that they could. And then you have a band like Metallica that was like going to war with Napster over like their 50 millionth, record. So I don't know. Everybody has a different opinion. I kind of go with the rocker that says, if you can't afford it, steal it, and if you can't afford it, please buy it. But it's a really tough question, And again, it's not something that I'm truly an expert in. Jordy?
Hola, Enrique. I have two questions. So first of all, I see you follow a lot of crypto people on Twitter. I'm curious, do you listen to podcasts or, outside of Twitter, how do you keep up with, the weekly news diet? And secondly, I don't know if you've spoken about this before, but I'm curious as to what you think Pleaser DAO should be doing with the Wu-Tang Clan album. Should they be allowing people to listen to it in small batches, or I don't know. Do you ever think about that album? Like, what are your thoughts about what should be done there?
Yeah, great question. So after hearing the Pleaser DAO question, I kind of lost your first one, so you're gonna have to ask it again. But I'll answer the Pleaser DAO side. So I'm really surprised at that whole thing. Like, I never sort of, I mean, I had this album, and it just seems really odd to me that there's this assumption that I don't have copies of it. So, like, to me, that's just really, really bizarre. Like, I haven't been home yet. So, you know, what's to say there aren't 10,000 copies of this album distributed on a cloud somewhere? Like, I don't, to me that was a really bizarre thing. Like, they bought the physical, but it doesn't seem like they bought the actual record. So there's a lot of kind of ambiguity there. So I don't know, maybe it'll be out sooner than you think. So to me, selling the physical was the easy decision. And it's a long story that kind of nobody knows, but I sort of looked for the buyer and had a buyer. And then it was sort of like topped up by this broker who I guess found Pleaser DAO. So, good luck to them. They have a $4 million piece of plastic, as far as I'm concerned. Like, the value of that record is the FLAC data, right? The MP3, the audio, the digital audio, and to me, that like, there's no guarantee that a hacker didn't take that from me in the first place. Like, why does anybody believe that music is valuable? I don't know, but I was glad to get rid of it at a higher price than I paid for it. That's for sure. So we'll see what happens with that. What was your first question?
Okay, I mean that's an interesting. Just to touch on that, don't you think that the whole NFT thesis is that you can basically copy paste. You can right click save, but this is the official original. So even if somebody else can see it, or in this case, listen to it, there's still some meme value or whatever you want to call it to the NFT.
Yeah, no doubt
And
about it. I just don't think that value is $4 million. Like to me, that'd be the most one of the most expensive NFTs ever, and it'd be for an audio file, which again has never been done before. So I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just not the price I would have paid. I had reasoned that after buying it for 1.5 million, I thought that at an auction I maybe would get 500,000. Then the NFT boom hit, and I was excited. So the government didn't care whether how I paid it or whatever. Like I had enough money to pay them with cash. I didn't need to sell the album. But I was like, gee, I'd rather, I want to maximize my resources. So once the NFT thing happened, I was like, holy shit, this is an NFT. Let me sell this. I don't want this thing anymore. If I can sell this thing for millions of dollars, I will. So I started making some calls. I won't mention who, but some very well known crypto Twitter people. And they were like, sure, I'll buy it for 2 million if that's what you want for it, no problem. And I was even talking to them about like, okay, they can hold it for me when I get back. I just wanted to get the government off my back. So then all of a sudden, like this other buyer came in, and it was all very opaque to me. So I just was like, okay, whatever, sell it. And then it ended up going to the wrong person in my eyes. I didn't even know it was going to Pleaserdao. I thought it was going to a friend of mine. And again, the government was very like ambiguous about it. And for a while, I even thought the Wu-Tang was buying it. So it was very weird. But in any event, I don't really care too much. I mean, I sort of got my fun out of the whole thing. I got a profit out of it. So onward and upward to different things. Like it was a fun stunt while it lasted. Like to sell something that has a natural half-life that's pretty short, like publicity stunts and like things like that have a very short half-life. Like, people are not going to be talking about Amber Heard in 2 weeks. We'll be on to something else. And that's kind of like the way I looked at the Wu-Tang album. It seems to have a life of its own and never die, but at the same time, like eventually nobody's going to give a shit and people are going to be like, oh, remember when, if they're not doing that already. So what was your first question, if you remember?
yeah, that's super interesting. The first question is outside of like following people on crypto Twitter, do you listen to any of the podcasts or like
Yeah.
kind of
So I don't really listen to podcasts. Sorry, I don't really listen to podcasts in prison. I couldn't really do so. So I was just sort of like, I'm starting to. I'm listening to Antonio's podcast, the guy who wrote Chaos Monkeys. It's pretty tedious. There's a lot of podcasts. So like to me, I like published research. I like, code. I like, things that are like, just takes on stuff seems to me like too flimsy. Like, oh, this is how I think about, this or that. It's like, cool. Like, do I really care? Like, what difference does it make? To me, something more immutable, something more formidable, like a new protocol, a new code base, a new app, something like that is more exciting. It's hard to sort of get too excited about like somebody's opinion about the news or like somebody's opinion about somebody's opinion about somebody's opinion. That to me is like a colossal waste of time. One of the things I thought about in jail a lot was like the rise of Netflix and Disney Plus and like all this content that Americans, not just Americans, but the whole world, but I think to some extent Americans, through our prosperity, we seem to have this like unending desire to consume content. We're consuming some right now, as a matter of fact. But like, you could be reading a book, you could be growing your skills, you could be doing whatever. Now it's a Friday night, so we should all be forgiven. But I don't understand, quite frankly, the person that watches Netflix 7 days a week. I don't understand the person that listens to 50 podcasts. Like that's just not me. Like I'm a workaholic. It's sort of like all work and no fun, but makes somebody a dull person. But at the same time, like that's just the way I'm wired. So like podcasts are never going to be my jam unless it's like a podcast that's really talking about really interesting things. Like Quanta has a podcast that's pretty good. But even then, I feel a little guilty, like listening to two guys who are really smart talk about quantum mechanics because I'm like, well, could I be using this time more efficiently? And that's all we've got, right? Is we've got time and we have to convert it into some usable resource. And if we do that improperly, we'll be homeless. And if we do it properly, we'll have all the resources we want. We can't look at the world so mechanically and coldly and economically. Of course, we all want to have fun and do things that are more meaningful than just converting our time resources into productivity. I sound like a machine. But it matters because depending on your other resources, you could spend time with your brother or sister or mother or father or what have you. Whenever you want, possibly, or whatever. I think it's important not to get like so sucked into the rat race that you don't have any fun and you don't have any meaning in your life. But at the same time, like if you're gonna work and you're gonna try to succeed, like you might as well try to do it as hard as you can, and then sort of take your free time and still have that meaning and purpose. So for me, podcasts seem mostly to be a waste of like hearing other people's opinions and other people's convictions that are probably pretty interesting entertainment, but not going to actually make me a better person or a healthier person or a smarter person or a more productive person. So let's go with Vishal. And if you guys, if you've had your question answered, if you don't mind stepping down so I can let some other people up, that'd be great.
By the way, Jordy, just coincidentally, I sent you cold DMs recently. I don't think you got to it, so if you could check that. Just speaking of going hard all the time and being a workaholic.
Will do.
Hey, Martin. Hope you're doing well. Thinking back to 2016, 2017, when you would stream your due diligence process on biotech names, like, would you say nowadays that investing in biotechs is more crowded, maybe more efficient, and there are less value arbitrage opportunities? Or do you think that the process of finding alpha and the ecosystem of opportunities is not that different than maybe, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Like, is it still viable to find a Vital Therapeutics or an Axokine from Regeneron, or is it just more difficult nowadays?
Oh wow, you went really way back for the Axokine. No, I mean I think there's still opportunities. Like the recent one was Cortexzyme, and there was a handful of other ones. That wasn't that recent, obviously, but Cortexzyme was like a pretty obvious short that I think short sellers made some money. And I think that actually you've seen a lot of biotech hedge funds kind of struggle. I think that's putting it mildly. And a lot of those guys are my friends, so I wish they make all the money in the world. Don't get me wrong, but I think that like there aren't as many short sellers as they were before. So when I was doing this professionally, what I found was there were like I could talk about one of them since they're no longer in business, but one of the biggest short sellers was Visium, which was a fund that came from Balyasny, which was a very big hedge fund. And Visium was quite good. They were sort of unfortunately ripped apart by an insider trading scandal, which ended up in a very, very sad situation where one of the partners actually committed suicide. Um, and it was a very big hedge fund. They shorted a lot. And I noticed when they left the market that shorting got a little easier and our options arbitrage got a little easier, which they were like very good at. So I think it depends on the state of the market participants to some extent. I think everybody has the same IQ. Like when you see a Vital Therapeutics, it's a pretty obvious short. But the question is, are there 10 other funds, competing with you to short Vital Therapeutics? If so, you're not going to have a great time relative to if there's only one. And it works the same way with value investing. If you have a lot of capital and everybody else has been bombed to bits, they're down 30% or they're down 50%. Well, investing is really easy if you have fresh capital or permanent capital or whatever. So I think, right now you have a market in pretty big disarray. So usually the best opportunities are when things are in pretty big disarray. And I do think that's where we're at. Whether there's some really great longs or really great shorts, you're going to have to, at least from my perspective, at least wait and see a little bit. I have to get sort of reacclimated to the market, but I will be talking about biotech stocks. And I will be finding some good shorts and shorting them, doing stuff like that. So we'll sort of see how that happens and where that unfolds. I don't know if I'll do a Substack or what, but I'll be talking about drug stocks from here to eternity. I think that there have been times where equities seemed quite arbitrage, and I think people when they invest have to think pretty hard about kind of this arbitrage coefficient or alpha coefficient and correlation. So obviously we all know we watch correlation coefficients, right? And the question is, in certain markets, correlation coefficients sort of go to one, right? Like Bitcoin becomes correlated, biotech stocks become correlated, they all become correlated. But that doesn't necessarily mean they don't become arbitrageable. So I think alpha is kind of its own variable. It's not the inverse of beta necessarily. So to me, like sometimes there's, like I said, with enough participants that are well capitalized and like in good stead. And by the way, there are plenty with Citadel, with Millennium, with kind of these market neutral mega kind of pod shops, Point72, and others. There are stable market participants out there to keep the markets from going too crazy. So I think that you have to sort of look at arbitrage in your own portfolio. And if you look at it and you say, gee, I can't find that many longs, I can't find that many shorts, well, listen, stay in cash. and do private equity. I think the problem with that modality is a lot of people can't do lots of asset classes, which is probably a good thing. But there's nothing wrong with like Balpost Seth Klarman, who's probably one of the best investors in the world. Listen, if you can't find great thick arbitrage opportunities, just relax, just keep looking and eventually you'll find them again. And if the worst case scenario is you're staying in cash and you're kind of don't feel like you're doing much, then you have to get used to that feeling, because it's like one of the healthiest feelings you can have as an investor is to just say no. Like, no, I'm not going to risk a 10% position to make 10%. So I make 1% in the end. If I'm wrong, I'm going to lose 10%. That risk reward doesn't make sense. So I think there's so much for patience, and it's really difficult for me. It was really hard to do as a hedge fund guy. I did so much better when I didn't have investors. When I had investors, it was really tough because you feel like you have to perform for them. But when you don't have investors, you can like take the day off and go to the park. Like, you don't have to force yourself to trade and force yourself to make mistakes. So I hope that's a little helpful, and I will be back talking about stocks. So Secret maybe wants to go.
Yeah, what's up, man? Thanks for having me up. I'll be really quick. I just wanted to throw in a comment. You said something about podcasts being tedious. Something I started doing maybe a year ago. Spotify, I think, introduced different speeds for podcasts. So I started listening to podcasts exclusively at 1.5x speed, and it's a little jarring at first. It'll take you a couple of podcasts to get used to it, but once you get used to the rhythm, it's great for just like quickly consuming podcasts. I don't even think about it anymore. Like a 30-minute podcast is over at the blink of an eye. So I feel like I'm not wasting as much time by listening at 1.5x. So I just wanted to throw that tip up there for anyone who likes podcasts, but acknowledges that they are kind of a time sink. Something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I'm going to ask my handsome co-host Hash to sort of help me out here a little bit, because I may need to take a 1 or 2 minute break. But
Yeah, for sure.
one of the things that I did is do the same thing for YouTube. So you can do that on YouTube, and I do think it helps a little bit. I mean, ultimately, I think the better thing to do is just to sort of screen your podcasts. Like, the idea of like listening to Call Me Daddy is probably something I can avoid. But like, if there's a podcast on software engineering or something like that, like, or crypto, for instance, like the better podcasts in crypto, I'm sure, are really informative and really interesting. And if you think there's one I really have to follow, just let me know. And I'm sure I'll kind of come across it myself. But ultimately, so I don't think it's like a wasted medium that's totally worthless. I think it is a cool thing. I think this is a cool thing. I think there's a lot of ways to communicate now. Clubhouse obviously is very similar, where you can sort of create and do something cool. But I think there's also just kind of like what's your sort of tried and true go-to thing. And for me, academic journals have been kind of one of those, and they're slowly to some extent being replaced or supplemented by podcasts, but there's nothing like a well-written experiment published in a prestigious academic paper. All right, Gabe.
Yeah, thanks for taking the question, Enrique. So I just had a question for you on the research and technology available to modern medicine. And hopefully this is somewhat relevant with the anniversary of Lou Gehrig's death yesterday, but just on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis as my example. Just as a layman, I mean, I'm curious from you, where you think some of these neurodegenerative or just diseases in general that seem to be uncurable, how would you explain that to the layperson who, thinks that there's lots of technology and different clinical trials available readily to modern medicine? And I get each disease is unique in its own regard, but I guess I'm just curious, where some of these issues could be tackled, or like how some of these cures could be progressed.
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and I hope I have a good answer. So I actually think I couldn't explain it to a layperson as easily as I could explain it to a laterally talented person or knowledgeable person in a different field. So a lot of people here are in software, and here's what I would say. Like, a lot of people would say, well, why can't I debug this software problem I have, or something like that? And let's say you had a compiled software, and they say, okay, well, I can probably disentangle this by reverse compiling it, decompiling it, and then playing with the assembler and very slowly stack tracing it to see if, okay, here's where there's an overflow, and here's where maybe there's a security hole or whatever. And so I would say that this is like, for ALS or for schizophrenia, perhaps, it's like taking a decompiled, some machine code decompiled, shredded in a paper shredder, sent into outer space in 100 different, directions, and then vacuuming it all up and piecing it together and then doing it. So like these problems, like complexity of the problem is higher than I think commonly acknowledged. So like, yeah, we have a lot of great technology for medicine, but you know, entropy is the enemy. So like you have it's easy to do for a rare genetic disease like it's easier, I should say. Take spinal muscular atrophy, which has went from a death sentence, like a literal instant death sentence. You had 6 months to live from birth. So really tragic, horrible, horrible disease. I like curse the disease every day I studied it because it was so um, cruel. And now it's a treatable disease. I'm not saying it's like a disease anybody should get or want. It's still a bad diagnosis, but it's a very much has changed from on a scale of 1 to 10, from 10 being the most catastrophic disease imaginable. It's gone from a 10 to something less than 10 for sure, which is amazing, and a pain to the success and some of the things I talked about earlier about ingenuity and engineering. Those are all American scientists and American companies that did that. So I'm gonna hoard all the glory for us, but uh, the point is, some of these diseases aren't that simple, and the amount of entropy created with the little genetic information code we have, and how it sort of like rapidly unravels into this more complex system. It's sort of like software. Like we have this very, very mundane, engineering problem that we can make more complex, and then, we have really, really not so great tools when it comes to like relative to like what a programmer has with a something like a debugger. There was a joke on Twitter earlier about using debug statements, like just simple print statements, to a log file to say, okay, this is where the program's going left, and that's sort of something that every programmer has done from time immemorial. No matter what you're taught on how to try and catch errors and stuff like that, you
Which,
still
by the way, I'm doing that right now as we speak.
right. You just basically have it print out some variable or have it print out some statement just to see if that function got called or not. We don't have those kinds of tools quite yet. So as modern as people assume that drug discovery and disease management or disease diagnosis and things like that, like we have a mass spectrometer, which has been around for 60 years. We have liquid chromatography, which has been around for a similar amount of time. Genomics has been around actually quite a while. So we have high throughput genomics and next generation genomics, but we've been able to sort of tell nucleic acid sequences for a long time. There's a company called Applied Bio that figured that out 40 years ago. There's polymerase chain reaction that is quite old as well. I think the Nobel Prize for that was awarded in the 80s. So, our tools haven't expanded as quickly as maybe we think or we're led to believe. There's a lot of new tools to make drugs, which is great, and some of them, like mRNA, clearly saved the day with the vaccine for COVID. So I think probably there's a misunderstanding, one, on our tools, and then there's a misunderstanding on the degree of difficulty. Like schizophrenia is very, very interesting to me because for a while it was big bread and butter for the pharma industry, and then there has not been a treatment advance in schizophrenia for around 30 or 40 years, and there's no good reason why. It's sort of a mix of lack of trying, it's a mix of lack of creative thinking, but really it boils down to the difficulty of the problem being like you have this crazy entropy that has resulted in a weird disease state of psychosis. um, and the same thing applies for bipolar and depression, mind you. So any psychiatric disease, you mentioned the neurodegenerative diseases, those are actually probably a bit more tractable than the psychiatric diseases, although ALS has been quite difficult. It's really unclear if ALS is a single disease. It's really unclear why some people with ALS die in 6 months and why some die in 5 years and why some don't die at all. It's a really, really tricky illness, to say the least, and people just don't know where to start. Why schizophrenia happens is probably one of the most interesting things to me because there's a meta disease there, right? You have something clearly going wrong biologically, but then the substrate is the mind, right? And you have this cause and effect that's very, very tough to figure out. So at least with ALS, you kind of have a very you know kind of touchable, palpable kind of thing going wrong. It's still not easy, and you've seen so many different ALS drugs not work over the last decade or two, even though there are ALSs that are caused by known genetic errors like SOD1 ALS and so forth. So it's a tough one. I think the short answer is entropy. Like there's just too much disorder and too much to disentangle that it seems like a straight shot, but it really is not. Like Alzheimer's is another one where it's really unclear what's going on in Alzheimer's at all. What's going on in ALS is also unclear. So we don't really know. And one of the things we're limited by in those diseases is we can't biopsy very easily kind of what's going on in an active brain or an active nerve system. Like it's really hard to sort of actively, like in programming, just like Hash was doing a minute ago. I can change something, then run the code and see what happens. Right? It's very hard to do that here, where you can't really do this rapid compilation, and trials take so long, right? Whereas in computer science, you click a button. So I think we're medicine is always going to move slowly, and I think that's one of the sadder things. That you see a lot of people talking about immortality and longevity and stuff like that. The reality is medicine is one of the slowest moving, most difficult, most regulated fields in the world, and it's really hard to sort of move the needle. If your disease is like, I had a friend die of cystic fibrosis when I was 19, and now cystic fibrosis is like for most patients is almost curable, which is like incredible. But unfortunately, his time, it wasn't for his time. And SMA is the same thing. Tens of thousands of people died of SMA, and now there's drugs. So like it's sort of a lottery of like, okay, when does the drug industry and academia figure it out? When they figure it out, you might get cured, you might not. ALS is one of these things where people have died of ALS, in the last 6 months, a year, last 2, 3, 4 years. Some people I know, and like who knows, maybe Biogen or one of these other companies comes up with a monster ALS drug. And that's why I think like the pharma industry really doesn't deserve to ever be demonized. Like I have so many great friends that have been saved by pharma. Obviously when you see things like Purdue, when you see things like ADHD drugs, even when you see things like me, like you get a little frustrated that, okay, this is bullshit. Why is this happening? But in reality, I think you look at the drug industry as it's really as an ensemble, singling out any one bad actor or putting that aside for a second. Like it's really an industry trying to do the right thing for humanity, and there's some people that are maybe doing the wrong thing and trying to hide it, or maybe in my case, I would just proffer maybe I was doing the right thing and kind of went about it the wrong way. But either way, like there's a lot of really great people in pharma that are working hard, especially in Cambridge, Mass, where you have tons of biotechs and pharmas really doing great research to save people's lives. And it's an industry I'm really proud of, but unfortunately have contributed negatively towards. So anyway, Will, do you want to jump in, or Hash? Go ahead.
Hey Martin, I just wanted to kind of jump in real quick because what you were just talking about ties in really well with the question I wanted to ask, which is, this kind of whole talk we've just been having about the progress of medicine and the progress of technology. I wanted to ask, do you think we might be thinking about all this in like very legacy terms? Because isn't the only real factor that matters towards any progress like just getting that AGI done? I know you did that predictions blog where you I forget when it was exactly, but you at some point said that AGI would be created. I think it was probably within the next 3 decades or so. But once we get that AGI, after that, all problems are basically going to be solved, right? Like, isn't that the mental model we should be thinking of rather than the old traditional ways of developing technology and developing medicine and treatments? When can we get that all knowing kind of AGI to solve any kind of problem that humanity has for it?
It's a crazy question, and I would open it up to the floor. I know we have a lot more questions to go, and we'll get back to a Q&A model, but let's maybe try to be more collaborative now. So feel free to jump in and answer. I'll give a real quick answer, which is I think partially that's probably true. But again, one of the things that's really hard about the future is predicting it. And, it's fun to try to imagine what the world will be like in 2050 or 2100. But, there are plenty of people that think, like we were talking about Penrose the other night, like there are people like Penrose that think what's going on in our minds is intractable to computing. And you see GPT-3 and you're like, man, we're getting close. Like these things are starting to think. It's getting real close and it's real scary. And maybe at some point I can have this machine do my job for me. How great would that be, right? So I think that is a really good point. I don't know what the answer is. I do think AGI will do a lot of stuff. Whether or not it's like the final question, I don't know. Probably is to some extent, but it's one of these things like, how could anyone have conviction in that answer? I mean, you could imagine it. You could imagine that these smart machines will replace the need for lots of things, and we could just focus on being happy, which has been elusive for forever. And maybe it's the end of humanity. I don't know, but I do think it's fun to think about and talk about. Again, I'm really curious what other people think. Just jump in if you have an opinion on AGI, and if you don't, make some emoji, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I'll just quickly finish those thoughts that I was bringing up earlier, and I do appreciate your response of, like, we don't really know when it's going to happen, like the so-called singularity. But as you said, like, they are getting really good. Where if you play with something like a GPT-3, I mean, personally, I like to say that I think that something like a GPT-3 might actually, quote unquote, feel something at this point. I don't know what it is. It's like maybe I don't know what consciousness is, but it certainly at this point, with, like, if you play around with it and it's like passing the Turing test is like, I mean, it's like aced the Turing test like a while ago.
Yeah.
Beyond that already. So I mean, stuff's just getting crazier and crazier, and at a faster rate than anyone has predicted. Like, nobody would have thought that the transformers and language models and stuff like that would be this good, this fast, and they're only getting faster. So
yeah. So just to make sure everybody knows, Hash is talking about a program called GPT-3 created by a company called OpenAI, and he's also talking about in general something called large language model, which is a new style of artificial intelligence software. Yeah, I mean, the idea that it's feeling something, I think you're a little bit ahead of me on that one. I'm not quite ready to resign on humanity just yet, but it's possible. I do want to do some robotics and, like, embed one of basically these GPT-3s in some robotics, and I have a new model that might be a little different from kind of the way we look at AI and training right now. I think that one of the weird things that we do is, like, take the whole corpus of the internet and throw it at a model, and you get something interesting, right? You got GPT-3, which seems a little bit more alive, and it seems a little smarter than old models. But I think there's more you can do. I think that one of the things that we do, for example, is we don't train these models very effectively. Like, we just do it once and done. Whereas if you look at the little models that we train when we start families and women get pregnant, and or people, I should say, get pregnant, because now people get pregnant, not just women. You can have a little neural network right there, and it takes a long time to train that little neural network. I think some neural networks train a little faster, some a little slower, but inevitably the neural network starts to talk around 2 years old or 1.5, starts to giggle and laugh and smile, and by 2 or 3, it's causing all kinds of havoc, and by 5 or 6, it can tell you all kinds of crazy things. So that neural network takes a long time. So the idea that you can just train a neural network overnight and it has feeling, I mean, that's incredible. It's possible, maybe, who knows? I don't know. But I think, like, the wetware that we've got is slower, right? A neuron is like 1,000,000 times slower than a transistor. So we'll see. Sorry about that. So yeah, so anybody else want to jump in? Will, maybe?
Hey Marvin, are you referring to me? By the way, that's like a sort of open invitation I have as a name. It's like a meme. Anyway, in the previous space, I noticed that you mentioned the word bijective functions near the end of it. And I was wondering if you're interested in sort of the bridge between math and computer science, basically, because there is a particular branch of computer science that deals with bridging these two, and it's called it's a bit tedious, but it's called formal methods. And basically, you can define a software system, its inputs, outputs, invariant, the model. And I was wondering if you are familiar with that at all. And sorry for my bad accent. I'm like foreign. I'm from Greece, your neighbor country. So I'm very sorry about the accent.
No, it's fine. I'm Albanian, so as you know, so
Yeah, I know.
where you could throw a rock and hit Greece from where I'm from.
Yeah.
So lots of great questions. So I love math. I studied a lot of number theory and algebraic, abstract algebra, algebraic number theory, cryptography, topology, graph theory, lots of stuff like that in prison. It was a good time to do math. But I didn't get that much done as it sounds, perhaps, but I got a little bit done. So I think like probably the best area for me in this space is, and I'll talk about formal methods and stuff like that in a minute, but probably my favorite space is theorem proving. And so I'm sure it sounds like you got some academic background in math. To me, like theorem proving was one of the first pieces of AI actually. If you read some AI history books, like this was one of the first places people pointed the AI gun towards and started firing. And there was actually a couple little successes. And then if you know enough math, you know about this four color theorem, which is really interesting. If anybody wants to Google four color theorem, it's basically this, oh gosh, it's a topology problem, I would say, but some people would say it's a group theory problem. But regardless, it's a problem in math where you basically are asking how many colors do you need to color a map such that they're adjacent states, if you will, of them on the map, or have
Adjacent contrast, maybe.
adjacent countries on the map, right? Don't share the same color. So, and it's the four color theorem. So anyway, this was proven by a machine, which was kind of like the first real proof by a machine. Some people believe it doesn't hold for that reason because it's a very long proof that's sort of like cheating. Um, but we have a lot of proofs in math, like the Goldbach conjecture or the Riemann hypothesis, or many others that are. I mean, Fermat's last theorem is, I think, still kind of to some extent still in that category, even though it was proven by Andrew Wiles. Of proofs that if a super intelligent machine could think about how to apply fairly elemental kind of operations, kind of the Pinot operations or Pinot logic. Or the ZF, was it Zermelo-Fraenkel system? These sort of basic math systems to these sort of givens and sort of result in a proof. What could you come up with? Could you prove something is true? Could you prove something's not true, like the continuum hypothesis? And I go on and on. I mean, there's dozens of these like important theorems. And heretofore, there's just been this assumption that it takes some brilliant person like a Gödel or like an Erdos or someone like that to come up, or Galois, or whoever, to come up with an answer. It takes some flash of genius like Ramanujan, who was said that he's a lot of his theorems were given to him by God, to actually sort of come up with some of these brilliant answers. And what if a machine could do it, right? And so theorem proving is one of my favorite areas. And I like the what most people say math and is math and computer science fused is complexity. So that's another one of my favorite areas, asking questions like, does P equal NP, or other important questions, and like just basic sort of mathematical side of computer science, the theoretical computer science. Now in formal methods, it's not an area that I'm well steeped in, but there is a piece of it that I know quite a bit about, which is the Gödel numbers, or Gödel numbering. I named it, my old software company, Gödel Systems. So the idea that you could take sort of like Alonzo Church's work, or certainly Turing, or Kleene, or people like that, and lambda calculus, and ask any question in a kind of a formal way, with similar to the Gödel's numbering, which I don't know if you're familiar with. You basically take a prime number and assign every computable operation to a prime number, multiply them all out, and sort of get a unique. You'll get a unique, sort of number at the end, which is a very large number, but you can embody any theorem in a number. And this can be used to prove some of the incompleteness theorem, where you can sort of talk about, well, is there a way to sort of describe a system outside of the system, and prove things from outside the system that are in the system, and all this sort of recursive stuff that has been talked about to death. A great book about it, if you want to learn about it, is called Gödel, Escher, Bach. Not my favorite book, but really, really beloved by everybody and anybody, by Douglas Hofstadter. Again, it's one of these books that's reputation is probably a little larger than its benefit. It's still a great book, but it's sort of an 8 out of 10, and everybody talks about it like it's the transcendent book, like the Bible. But I don't know what do you think, Will?
It could be that it's the results of that book are incorporated in the field now. I'm not familiar with the book, but when something that's big, it, that isn't that interesting, something that's considered big, is usually because it's really incorporated in other things, and people are familiar with the concepts it describes. So yeah, thanks a lot for answering my question. And I also wanted to say that you could listen to the guy that made Java has an interesting uh, podcast on. He was invited in Lex Friedman, and it was really interesting. At least seeing how a person that made something that big, such as the JVM, can think. And you wouldn't expect, for example, that he isn't a very verbal guy, but the people that are advocates of Java are sort of very formal with wording and naming of functions and variables. And the guy isn't himself that made it isn't very formal. So you can find by reading people through podcasts, you can find interesting information that makes you get perspective on what matters, basically. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can shoot me a DM with the podcast, I'd love to listen to it. Maybe
Yeah,
we can.
sure thing.
Thanks a lot. Maybe we can go to 48.
Hey, Martin. Thank you for having me up. I kind of have a selfish question. I guess it's not as interesting as everybody else's, but unfortunately, my cousin is going away for roughly about the same time that you were away. So I guess just asking for any advice you have for the family, for him especially, just anything that you could think of that would help pass the time and make sure that he continues to develop.
Yeah, sorry to hear that. First of all, I think, and there I noticed there's some lawyers in here and stuff like that. So, I think the biggest thing is like just to have the handful of people that you really care about that they do their best to stay in front of that person. I was very, very, very lucky. I have some people here that I talk to. I wouldn't say every day, but pretty close, and that makes the time go. I think finding contrition and understanding and like all that stuff's really important too. Like I think from his perspective, coming to terms with what you did and what you did was wrong and kind of like accepting that. I think virtually everyone in prison did commit a crime. Now, I believe that we're doing too much time for those crimes, but I think that, not many people in prison are like, innocent. And I know that's kind of sobering to hear from like my hardcore right wing libertarian fans. It feels like it's not true. And there are definitely a lot of prosecutions that people are just getting picked on, but fairly rarely does the system get it wrong. So I think, getting some contrition and accepting that sort of punishment as sort of something you can grow from. Thankfully, your family member, I think it was, or friend, didn't get a sentence that was, absurdly long. So if I could survive it, he could survive it, or she can survive it. Is the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is it's not that bad, So unfortunately, I had somebody who I mentioned previously who committed suicide before they were even found guilty, let alone sentenced. And that person probably wouldn't have spent that much time in prison. So it was really, really unfortunate. So the answer is it's not that bad if you can grow from it and if you can benefit from it. And I spent a lot of time growing, but I've met a lot of people in prison who didn't spend any time growing. They probably regressed, and it's very easy to regress if you let your mind kind of mess with you. I think that like there are people who spend their time in prison getting high. There are people who spend their time in prison watching TV, blaming the government. That's not the right thing to do. You don't have to sit there and beg for forgiveness and mercy and like feel sorry for yourself every day. You can look forward and not backwards. But I still think like you need support from your friends and family. That's really important, and spend your time productively. Like I think you can definitely get something out of prison. Like you're not going away to like a lot of people say, "Oh, I lost 4 or 5 years of my life." That's total bullshit. Like if you want to lose 4 or 5 years of your life, you can do that in prison or not in prison. you you get 4 or 5 years of waking up every morning, and those 8 hours that you spend asleep are the same 8 hours everybody spends asleep. The same 2 or 3 hours you're going to spend in the bathroom or eating or whatever, those are the same or 2 3 hours that are going to be wasted by everybody. So the question is, what are you going to do for those kind of 12 hours where you're sentient and you don't have to do chores? And are you going to make the most of it, or are you going to waste it? And I think, a lot of people think of prison as, oh man, this is lost time, but like it really isn't. You get a lot of time to think about who you are, who you want to be when you come out, the mistakes that you made, what might have led to them, how are you going to avoid them going forward. There's a good time for not just redemption, but just life planning and coaching in general. It's going to be harder when you get out. There's no doubt about that. Your life's kind of turned upside down. But I think if you prepare and plan and learn something while you're in prison, your life could actually come out just fine. So I wish your friend the best of luck. And I think just constantly writing, the family and friends constantly writing, sending emails, just a little email or a call here and there goes a really long way. So good luck with that. Maybe we go to Ozone or Aduana, I should say. Sorry.
Hey man, thanks for hosting this, and also want to thank you for the YouTube videos you put out on kind of financial modeling a couple years ago. I thought those were, I mean, just as a college student watching those and how you kind of spoke about the assumptions that go into valuing a business, I thought it was pretty different from what we hear from college professors, and pretty refreshing. My question was a broader, I guess, not to opine much on macro, but as someone who's kind of been in public markets and who's been out of it, I mean, what do you think of the broader state where we kind of had this decade of really cheap capital and a lot of businesses funding growth through the income statement, and now we're kind of at this what seems to be a paradigm shift with energy driving inflation a lot higher, but at the same time demographics and fertility rates being really low, and that long term being the driver of a lower cost of capital. um, what do you see as the kind of cost of capital and the cycle, and what we're seeing now in the macro world, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, really smart questions, and I thank you for your positive feedback on the videos. I'll definitely be doing more of them. I think the fertility problem I'm looking to personally solve by myself, so you'll look out for that, and hopefully I can, help move the needle there. But jokes aside, I do think we have um, an interesting macro situation. I mean, I think cost of capital is like what you make of it. Like there have been plenty of great companies started in bad times, and there have been plenty of bad companies started in good times. In fact, usually that's how it works, right? When there's too much capital, you get dynamics like Board Ape JPEG selling for $300,000. You get people who want to go on a 5 minute space ride for $25 million. You see all the sort of silliness that's sort of happening, um, and at the peak of a cycle. And now we're seeing kind of the not peak of a cycle. Prices are down, inflation's up. It looks like it's going to get worse. Somebody asked a question like this recently. Now, I think this is like why, like for example, like the Daraprim price increase. Not to talk about that, but like there's a really great benefit to having a profitable company, right? Like if you look at Pfizer or Merck or Johnson and Johnson, like this is the time they lick their chops. Like this is the best time ever for them. Like we're all sitting here upset, like, oh, my portfolio is down. What's going to happen if unemployment goes from 3.8% to 8.3%? Et cetera, et cetera. But like if you're Microsoft or you're Oracle or you're like this big company, or even if you're like not a big company, but just a company that's profits a lot in good times and a little in bad times, even then, as long as you don't lose money in bad times, like you love recessions because it's the time when people hunker down, they get more efficient, stuff like that, and you can buy your competitors, your weak competitors. And if you're a biotech company, this is the worst time for you because your stock maybe just went from a $2 billion company to a $200 million company. Not a whole lot has changed, right? Other than the cost of capital, and basically your stock got squashed. So you can't fight off the Pfizer because you might need another 200 million to finish your project. So it's much harder to raise that 200 million. So maybe you sell to Pfizer, and we saw one company sell to Bristol Myers today. We'll maybe have that exact discussion, right? So I think like you have to have profits like that as a business. That's one of the most important things. So cost of capital is irrelevant if you're making profits, right? Like at the end of the day, like you can do just fine with if you're self-sustaining business. If you need capital, then your cost of capital is relevant. If you don't need capital and you create capital, then you're a happy camper. So I think like owning something, whether it's a home or whether it's a business that makes money or something is sort of the desired goal, because that's when this is the time when you get rich, right? Like this is the time when if you're Pfizer or even a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, you don't have to be giant, but right now universities, biotech companies, they'll in maybe 6 months from now, even more, they basically will give away anything because they can't raise money, right? Or raising money is too expensive. So this is where you get your bargains. The same thing applies to individuals, right? Like if you have a portfolio that, or really, let's say you have a really great job and you make $1 million a year, right? And your portfolio is $10 million. You're sort of fine if your portfolio gets cut in half, because every year you get to add $1 million of fresh capital, and assuming that 10 million that went to five will come back, which probably will, you kind of don't care about that short term um, drop. You probably are more excited about the fact that you can throw an extra million in every year. And if you have any cash left over in your portfolio, you're really excited. So I think like the number one goal is to always keep some cash in your portfolio. There's people that not only are fully invested, they invest on margin. And I've learned the hard way that that's like the worst thing you can do. The best investors I know have like 30% to 50% in cash at all times, because they know that, especially around times like this where things almost seem like they're too good, like 6 months ago or a year ago, things are almost too good. Every stock was up a lot, crypto was going crazy, NFTs were going crazy. Like, call me old fashioned, but like I just don't think all the Bored Apes combined are worth $3 billion. Like, they're just photos. They're not particularly great art. Yes, it's an interesting moment in time. Yes, it's a sea change and a paradigm shift. I'm a big fan of crypto. I mean, I'm not like some crypto hater, but I just don't think those files are worth what they're trading for. And I'd much rather have like say I have 10 Bored Apes. I'd much rather have a $2 or $3 million home, and I'm not even a fan of real estate. Uh, then I'd have 10 copies of poorly drawn, kind of pieces of artwork. Again, I don't think they're worthless. I just don't think they're worth what they're trading for. So it's a long story of just sort of saying like these cycles happen, they're normal, and they sort of separate kind of, you know, people who have planned carefully, who have cash, who have capital, who generate more capital, and people who don't plan carefully and who have been kind of, well, and again, there's nothing wrong with having a biotech company that's just in the middle of a project and then the market goes to shit. But you also have to realize as an employee or as a shareholder of that biotech company, like, yeah, it's risky business. There's risk implicit in a business that's unprofitable. And Coinbase is another good example where Coinbase, like, listen, everyone's talking about how they have a lot of issues, that they fired a bunch of people, that they're rescinding the offers they made to people, which is kind of ridiculous. At the end of the day, they're fighting for survival. So, like, they don't want to go bankrupt. So ultimately, you know, when the tide goes out and cost of capital rises dramatically, and you're not very profitable, you do have to make some changes to the business. And that's why I think you have to think about this stuff before it happens and assume it'll eventually happen. And it's not a lot of fun when conditions are good. You kind of want to just let it rock and keep growing. But nobody wants to hear about conservatism when the market's going crazy and everybody's hiring and everybody's rich off of crazy stuff. But you don't want to be the person kind of like, trying to stop the party. But I think the responsible thing to do is to do that. Ozone, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, what's up? Mark? Um, I was just wondering if in crypto, there's always people building and developing protocols, but I was wondering if it was uh, just feasible to use programming not to develop, but sort of game the systems, so to say, to like maximize EV. Sort of like, have you seen the movie The Imitation Game with the Enigma machine?
Sure.
Sort of like that, like man can't be machine, but machine can beat machine. So would it be feasible to
learn programming in the effort to beat the protocol, I guess, or gain it in a sort of way.
I'm not 100% sure what you're asking, but I think that one of the things that's coming up here is basically, you're talking about sort of cryptographic protocols, their security. Is it possible to use AI or other tools to actually crack some of these protocols? Is that a fair
Well,
synopsis? Or
well, not really crack it, but like kind of just as from a trading point of view. How there's like there was
oh,
like
I see.
OHM and what it I guess it's hard to make sense of, but um,
Well,
just using your would it be smart to learn programming to use it to I guess get the most profitable trade or
sure,
most
sure. So now I understand where you're going. So there's a great book called The Man Who Solved the Market. Um, it's by a Wall Street Journal writer. His name escapes me at the moment, but the book is about Jim Simons, who's a computer programmer, and he was actually a code breaker at the place before they called it the NSA. So he was a math professor. He's very celebrated academic, and then he, at the age of 40, decided to do a complete career change and become a trader of all things. Well, he tried to trade and it didn't work. He tried to trade based on his instincts and information and things like that, and then he decided to program a computer to trade. And then the world changed. He single-handedly kind of ushered in this quantitative revolution. He wasn't the first guy to do it, but he was amongst the first, and he ended up creating one of the, if not basically the most successful hedge fund ever. He's the most successful investor of all time. And he's not a person that looks at balance sheets. He's not a person that looks at stock charts. He's a person that programmed or helped hire a team that programmed a computer to trade automatically. And he made the most amount of money in the stock market ever. More than Warren Buffett, more than George Soros, more than Steve Cohen, etc. Hash?
I believe they're called magicians.
Yeah, the fund made around 80% a year for a very long time. So Simons has arguably was one of the richest people in the world. If you sort of would securitize his company, it would be worth more than Goldman Sachs. So anyway, trading with a computer is probably kind of like trading without a computer is probably kind of like being in professional sports or MMA without steroids. Like, you can try it, but most of those guys are doing steroids for a reason. And I think in this case, you actually don't have the downsides of steroids, the health effects and so forth. So, you kind of have to do it at this point to keep up with the Joneses. Like, trading without computer help is almost like as crazy as, like, I don't know, doing your own spell checking or, whatever, like photocopying instead of, I don't know, pick any like archaic thing. Like, so the day of the stock picker that's like a gumshoe that's like looking at balance sheets and interviewing management, like, it's slowly starting to kind of go away, I think. And if you look at most of the successful hedge funds now, they're more quantitatively oriented, even if they're not completely computer decisions. The computers are making more and more part of that decision. So I highly recommend that you learn to program if you want to learn how to invest. So, PF Rube, what do you got?
Hey, Enrique. Thanks for hosting. I just first want to say I really appreciate all your music. I don't know, I just love the reggaeton, genre and what you do with the brand and
De
the
nada.
type of music is, I don't know, something special. So I appreciate that. I kind of want to move away from music and talk more about just crypto in general and your time within prison, or however you called it. What was like the general sentiment among your fellow colleagues or prisoners? I don't know what the exact term is. Um, about crypto while you were inside? Could you feel kind of like the similar types of euphoria or depression that we could feel on the outside, I guess? And, any other insights that you could draw about the markets?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Obviously, you wouldn't normally kind of look at prisoners as um, a pool or population that anybody's truly interested in their financial viewpoints, but you see a lot of different people in prison. I mean, it's pretty fascinating. So um, there were some interesting pieces of it. I think a lot of people are enamored with crypto in prison. Not probably on a different like percentage of population than you see out there. there's a lot of interest in starting fresh after committing a crime. And I think that crypto sort of promises that from an anonymity perspective. It promises it from like kind of like a new leaf perspective. You have people in crypto who are very prominent who have been to prison. So there is a little bit of a counterculture slash kind of I don't know, irreverence that is in the community that's sort of a little more accepting than maybe a more stodgy community. You know, there's sort of a rule breaker mentality. So you do have a little bit of that. Having said that, you know, there is this sort of same skepticism that you see out there, where it's like, okay, do I want to replace fiat? I kind of like fiat. I'm used to $100 bills in the case of a criminal. I'm used to a fat bank account. I'm not too excited about having this crypto that's you know unclear to me what this is worth, if anything. You had some guys. I met a guy in prison who had a Bored Ape. So he's coming out pretty soon. He's doing a very quick in and out stay. But so you had people in prison that really understood. Like my buddy here was here earlier, who did quite a bit of time, and he was like a really really sharp. He's a crypto trader. Like he's sharper than I am. So you get all kinds of guys. Like he was a computer hacker. If you were here at the very beginning of this chat, so I don't think there's a lot to glean and kind of like distill and infer, but I do think it is cool to see like the unbanked. I think that's Vitaly Buterin's sort of like one of his big proposals here is that you got a billion people that are unbanked. I'm more or less unbanked. Like it's very hard for me to keep in whole bank accounts. So whether you're a former criminal or somebody who is not liked, or maybe both, you're going to have a hard time sort of dealing in society. And I think that one of the promises of crypto is sort of this level playing field where everybody's sort of equal on the blockchain. So I don't know if that helps. CF, do you want to jump in? And if you have already asked your question and you want to step down and make room for somebody else, I think that'd be great. Go ahead, CF, whenever. Or Owl, Chief Financial Autist. You're currently not audible to me, at least. Dino, do you want to jump in? Well, CF?
Hey, Enrique. I have a random question. I joined one of your Twitter spaces before your profile got deleted. You held a short 40-minute Twitter space responding to some criticism and on your project, and you kind of clarified slightly what your project was about. I just kind of wanted to see if there were any updates on it. The things that kind of interested me from that discussion, particularly that I remember. By the way, I don't have any background in like biomedical science, so I don't remember the specifics. But I remember you talking about kind of individuals who really care about a particular rare disease being able to create the research component necessary for them to do that, and kind of creating an open market and doing that through blockchain and crypto technology. So I just kind of wanted to see if there was any update on that and how things are going with that.
Yeah, I know that we have at least one expert in here, Mr. Eigenspace, who knows a lot about this stuff, and probably a couple more people. So yeah, I mean, some people design drugs using computers, and that's currently rather expensive and difficult. And I think I'd like to release some software that changes that. That's basically the upshot. I do think that the hardest part about that is once you do all the software stuff correctly, which I don't think is that hard. The hardest part of that, kind of like designing the front end and making an experiment, a virtual experiment, kind of simple. By far, the hardest part that comes next is the compute costs. So you need really powerful computers and a lot of electricity, and that is not something everybody has. In fact, that's something basically nobody has. You need Amazon Web Services. You need a supercomputer. You need something that it's hard to do with your phone or your desktop. Nevertheless, some people try and do it with their desktop. So you can probably screen, I don't know, 10,000, 20,000 compounds a day on a modern desktop. So if you had 100, that'd be nice. And you can rent 100 computers on Amazon pretty easily. It'd be even nicer if you could do 1 billion compounds. Then you would need 100,000 computers, which is not so affordable or easy. So anyway, the point is that let's say you had a really good idea on how to cure or treat, I should use the treat word, treat Alzheimer's disease by blocking a protein called CXCR3. This is not a new idea. Some people think CXCR3, by blocking that specific protein, you may treat Alzheimer's disease. Do I know? No, I don't. It seems like a reasonable idea. Is it going to work for sure? No, I really don't know. It probably won't work, in fact. So the point is, you don't know how to block CXCR3. Now, there's traditional ways you could do this with test tubes and beakers and wet labs and all the equipment that comes with, that, and pipettes and chemical libraries, and doing a so-called high throughput screen. That's traditional pharmaceutical stuff. But you could also do an in silico screen or a virtual screen, and that's something that I've done. I've sort of done both sides of this. And a virtual screen basically takes a whole bunch of molecules from a file and designs a sort of 3D space, and just basically measures how each one of those molecules changes the total free energy of that sort of complex. The lower the free energy, the better. The universe likes the lowest amount of energy state. And so you look and sift and score every single one of those molecules until you find the one with the lowest state, or maybe the top 100 or the top 500 or whatever. And you have clues now for what could be drugs, what could be blockers of that protein, in this case, CXCR3 for Alzheimer's disease. Maybe you think a different protein will cure Alzheimer's disease, in other words, blocking that protein. Almost every drug that we have is a blocker of a protein. So that's sort of the theme here. So finding a blocker for a protein and hoping that when you put that into a human, that it will work. Of course, you still need to put it in an animal. You still need to put it in different cells, in vitro, as they say. You have to do toxicology, very inhumane process, in vivo, usually in 2 different species, such as rats or dogs, but at least 2 species. So ultimately, very tragic sort of experiment that you have to do and euthanize those animals and determine whether your drug was toxic or not. So again, tons of things you have to do after the in silico part. But let's say you decided that that was the experiment you wanted to do, but you don't have a billion a billion compute cycles. You need to buy them, and they're really expensive. Well, you could put your project up on our platform. And again, we haven't announced it yet, so we still have a ways to go. You're sort of asking me to prematurely announce it, which I don't want to do. But basically, it'd be nice if there was a platform that allowed you to sort of distribute that problem across a huge network of computers, and people could contribute their compute cycles. Whether they want to do that for free or not, I don't know. They might want to charge you. But if you put up your project and said, listen, join my Alzheimer's research project, I'm willing, I don't have any money. I'm relying on your sort of generosity to contribute your compute cycles. Just put it on your screensaver. If enough people do that, you will get your billion compound screens. So now, if you're a big company, you may use my software to basically just say, I want to screen 1 billion compounds. And oh, by the way, I have $1 million. So if you do my job, I will pay you in Solana or in Ether or in whatever the case may be. So, it's traditionally how companies do it now. It's a very sort of gate-kept field where academics and even big pharma have a tough time using the software. It's very kind of technical and difficult to use. And especially the compute part of it is actually still rather a bit of an unsolved problem. So anyway, look out for that. But that's kind of something I've been working on for a long time, and excited to finally release it at some point soon. Victor, do you want to jump in?
Hey, Enrique. Good to talk to a fellow Albanian that is a reggaeton superstar. So
yes, there are not many Albanians in reggaeton.
I know, right? So it's a nice niche market. So my question is more, when you're talking about consumption and like Netflix and all this stuff, and a lot of stuff being a waste of time, how do you approach, I've been following, I forgot who it was talking about your finance courses. I think ever since then, following a bunch of stuff you put out there. How do you go about like learning a new industry, new field? How do you approach it? I'm just curious about your take on learning and how you approach looking for papers, new protocols, and Web3, all of this.
Yeah. There's a great book by Josh Waitzkin called The Art of Learning, and he was a chess master who became a Tai Chi champion. So he went from a very boring kind of game called chess to a very exciting and difficult martial art called push hands, which is very, very competitive and very dangerous. It's not the Tai Chi you see in the park. And so how do you do that, right? How do you go from a child chess prodigy? He's the inspiration for the film Searching for Bobby Fischer, which was a big Hollywood movie a lot of people have seen. And so how do you go from doing that to that? I'm no Josh Waitzkin. and no Bobby Fischer, and certainly no martial artist. So I think that the answer is, I think you have to, like, the long answer is you just have to have a lot of like joie de vivre and love for knowledge, and like you really have to have a ton of energy for learning things, and you have to sort of cultivate that, aha and eureka moments. Like, those are the most exciting things to you. They're more exciting than an orgasm. They're more exciting than the sun hitting your face on a beach. That those are really what you care about and love. And some people just aren't built for that. Some people don't care about that. And I hope that most people aren't built like that. For me, that's more exciting to me than any of the things I mentioned. And, that's what I love. So learning requires that, because if you don't really love kind of the process of learning and the tedious parts of it, which are like I just downloaded some book that's like 1,500 pages, and I'm like, oh Jesus Christ, do I really want to read this? It looks like a mess. But yeah, I kind of do, and I want to almost challenge myself to see, like, can I do it? And the answer is I really can't. Between all the things I have to do and all the places I got to be, and all that, I'm gonna fail at that goal. But how much of it can I accomplish? What can I glean from it? All those things are important questions, because I meet people like my partner on the computational chemistry side, who humbles me with his brilliance, and people in business and other people like that I want to sort of be like. And if you hold your standards high, that you want to impress and be on those people's level, and some of the people aren't that well known. Like, I've unfortunately become a household name, but the guy in my project hasn't, and I think he probably prefer it that way. But the point is, he's ton more intelligent than I am, and I just want to be able to sort of even keep up with him. And if you have that motivation and that competitiveness, I think you will learn. Is there a specific process to learning a specific thing? No, obviously there's, if you're learning technology, you have to mix obviously your theoretical knowledge with actually putting your hands on software. It's really hard to learn software from a book. The same thing applies in business. You can read all the business stuff you want and go get all the MBA degrees you want and so forth, but you actually have to do business sometimes. Trading works the same way, investing works the same way. You have to have a mix of actual practice. I think law works the same way. If for example, my lawyer, or one of my lawyers, who is my criminal attorney, is a fantastic criminal attorney. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy. There's nothing that, like, intelligence wise you can put past him, but his real brilliance is his practitioner nature, right? He actually goes in courtrooms and gets people acquitted. That's hard. That's really, really hard to do. Most of the people who, when I asked him, like, why should I work with you? His simple answer was, I've actually gone in a courtroom and come out with my client after hearing the words not guilty. And almost every lawyer you're interviewing right now has never done that. And I was like, yeah, you know what? You're hired. And he got me not guilty on 5 out of 8 of my charges, which is also a pretty good accomplishment. So the point is, like, you got to mix, kind of theory with practice. You have to, put in more hours of work that are attentive, productive hours than anybody else. Carl Malone had a very poignant kind of perspective on that he was upset when he wasn't at the gym because he knew somebody else was at the gym, and whoever else was at the gym while he was not at the gym was getting stronger and bigger and becoming a better basketball player. And, like, you have to be that competitive, and love it to really get somewhere. And those are a couple of thoughts I have. I don't know if that helps, but I'm going to just do a couple more minutes. Maybe X-Tanger wants to jump in.
Hey, Martin, how are you?
Hey.
You know what? I have a personal thing to say first. Thanks to you, I've gotten hooked onto Twitter Spaces. I don't know if that means anything. Probably not.
No,
but
it's great. I'm happy I
yeah.
could help.
The second thing is, this is something for you. There's a company in Toronto called Cohere, Cohere, so natural language processing. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah, I've heard of them. I just people
do
have
some
mentioned
digging. Do some digging. These guys, I know the guys personally. They're friends of mine. Wicked smart.
They're
smart.
They're like an LLM, right? They're competing a little bit with OpenAI.
They're ahead.
Yeah. There you go.
They're
Very
ahead.
cool.
So I figured you'd probably enjoy that because I find you as, and I hope you take this in the most loving way. You have a devious, brilliant mind, which I think is required when you're in business.
No, I appreciate it.
Seriously. Couple things. You kind of remind me of, culturally in a different time, Michael Milken. And he reinvented himself and he created the Milken Institute and the Milken Conference. You know what? I really truly believe you, in a very different way, could in fact have a very different group of people that are attending on topics that are probably way more relevant, or let's say below the line, where Michael is, with the politics and all that. So um, I'd really encourage you to think about that, because
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people that are in this space who are asking questions. We're not judging. We're like brilliant people that have figured something out. Obviously, they've gotten their head financially. Maybe legally, they've made some mistakes. But I mean, for God's sakes, thank God we live in a society where we can come back. Um, the real question that I want to ask you is, I believe we're in a moment right now when it comes to talent, and attracting talent is never been easier, but at the same time more difficult in terms of figuring people who have that kind of attitude, that curiosity, that voracious appetite, and at the same time just kind of like a humble approach, and wanting to be surrounded by other smarter people. And how do you do it? Because I'm thinking that Y Combinator came and gone, MIT Labs kind of sort of still there, and I know Launch House is in New York and LA. Mark Andreessen has invested in them. And I think there's another spot there for crypto to like basically create a hacker house that's almost like an invite only thing. And in a strange, intuitive way, I have a sense that how would you approach that? And would you want to be a part of it?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much. Milken is high praise. I do think that a little bit of what he's done with his institute and so forth has been partially image repair, partially kind of. Again, I'm not going to take anything away from the guy, but he successfully got a U.S. pardon, so he's no longer technically a felon, which is a big accomplishment for him. In terms of like talent and stuff like that, I think that it's really corny, but like the little software team that I've assembled is like the group of the best. Like we're all going to a wedding. Like we haven't been at the company for 4 years, and every single one of us is going to a wedding in a couple of weeks, or about a month. And it's because like we all truly have this like profound love for each other, and it's really like it's the strangest thing in the world. Like any company I've ever worked at, I don't talk to anybody basically anymore. Like especially 3 or 4 companies ago, and all of these guys, we have this like crazy bond that's like unbreakable, and it's just so weird. And I think a big part of it is like as a manager, you just have to start to like break this mold that you're. I mean, other managers do this, but you really have to break down that barrier of like I'm the boss and you're not. And I think that's the first thing that has to go in every organization. And I think what Gabe at Valve and like their whole like the way they work at all.
I don't know who you're referring to.
Okay, so Valve is a computer video game software company that is not only makes video games, but they also have the most successful platform for video games called Steam. And Steam is just sort of a toll taker. They're sort of like an app store for video games. They're a multi-billion-dollar company. They've done very well. Gabe's like this very like humble hacker that just like they're all on these like mobile desks. Your desk moves with you, so you can go around your desk and like just decide where you want to sit on any given day. And Gabe responds to emails. He's on message boards. He's like still the average Joe. And I think like managers like that can build a culture of a place where people actually love to work, which is really hard to do because nobody loves to work anywhere. I mean, a lot of people are Machiavellian. They want to work a few years at a place for the quote unquote for the resume, and then jump from a Google or an Apple to do their own thing or whatever. And you really don't want people like that, even if they're good, because you want the person that like doesn't have that like I guess prescribed like career arc in mind. They are, if you can make them happy, they're going to stick with it. If you can make them happy is different from can pay them the most, right? And make them happy is different from solve every problem they have. I think creating a work family that like people really like is difficult, and I think other people have tried it, and failed. I think this was the one time in my life after starting a lot of companies, I tried it and it worked. And it didn't work perfectly. There's like one person we don't talk to and stuff like that. But like, it generally worked. And I want to keep sort of trying to lead like that. It's one of the hardest things managers have to do. And management, there's tons of books about management. There's tons of books about DevOps and management. And, I think the secret for me, one of the secrets has been to try to learn what your coworkers are learning and respect them on a level that is more than just like, oh, I'm a big shot. Like Mark Andreessen's interesting because like he was
Mm-hmm.
a real software guy. He has the bona fides, but like I don't know to what extent he still does or doesn't. And again, I respect him tremendously and look up to him. But I think once you start floating from being kind of like a practitioner to being a quote unquote manager, I think you start to lose that connection that can allow for that mutual respect and that again, for
So
lack of a better term, love.
so I'm wondering if you might be able to do me a favor. If you have like a short list of people that you consider like these are amazing people in crypto to follow, because I see that with crypto Twitter, it's kind of missing. It's all over the place. But one last thought, right? With the billions of dollars, that $4.5 billion fund that Andreessen Horowitz has, and then there's like Paradigm Unchained, all these guys are in the place. There's a lot of dry powder that's out there that are looking and hunting for some amazing projects. And my sense is that there is no one here who's actually organizing the best of the best out there. In other words, not some Russian team that's just rinsing and repeating and pumping and dumping, but something that maybe is US based that involves some. I'm Canadian, so, um, but I'm now living like in the Caribbean. Maybe the moonlight is hitting me, so I'm enjoying the waves here, listening to you. But you hear where I'm going with this? It's kind of like it's this really beautiful moment of gathering some talent and understanding that there's a lot of possibilities. And I agree with you in terms of the crypto thing. It's more than just the JPEGs. And I'm wondering who's out there that's thinking in terms of that paradigm shift, that Z axis movement, and where are those developers and are they gathering and who's organizing them? And that's why I brought up the whole Michael Milken thing. I really do believe there's a chance here to sort of like create another container to get everybody around. I appreciate all your thoughts.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I mean, I think that you have a lot of competing problems, right? So you have those billions of dollars stashed aside, ready to deploy, and then you have people like you. You would be shocked at the amount of people I've talked to just in the last few weeks. I've been out of prison not 2 weeks, and just the crazy amount of people who said, "I watched your videos, I grew up in your videos, and now I'm the CEO of this little company, and we raised 5 million or 10 million or whatever."
Shut up.
And yeah, there you go. And even a dude who has one of the biggest software companies in the world now, one of the biggest private software companies in the world now, said the same thing to me. So all the way from smaller ones to bigger ones, and I'm really flattered, obviously, but at the same time, like those guys have the same job, and the problem is they're mercenaries. Which I don't fault them because I did that too. I publicly traded company that I wanted to bring the best people in and incentivize them and grow them, and some of them stopped over for a quick ride, some of them were more permanent. And how do you find like a real company or build a real company or a real team that grows forever? I think that's what Microsoft did, to be honest. I think that's what some of these companies, they don't do it perfectly, but I think the early story of Microsoft and the early story of Google, like that's what happens when you can actually do that. Like that's the kind of company you build, a once in a generation type of company, when you can really get people to buy in on the CEO. I know that Steve Ballmer and Bill Gates personally interviewed, not Steve Ballmer, but at least Bill Gates personally interviewed the first 100 or 200 people at Microsoft. And I think like that kind of like personal touch where like, as a CEO, like what you do on a daily basis is basically irrelevant. It's what the 200 people do. And if you can personally involve yourself in their lives, like personally really understand who they are and what gets them going, and make sure that you're doing what it takes to make their lives better make and therefore make your products better, that's like ultimately your job. And I think so much of like the ego that's driven from like having this big valuation and having this big stock option plan and all that bullshit is kind of like it'll work until it doesn't. And the market goes down and your valuation's half what it was. Nobody's happy in your office anymore because you only hired these people that like what makes them happy is big numbers. Your company's going to basically go bankrupt or fall apart because if that's all they cared for, then you're not going to get there. Like, again, and it's sometimes stupid things. It's not perks like, oh, we have free McDonald's or free candy bars or free whatever it is that gets the staff going. I don't know what they do at Google. You have free avocado lattes or whatever they drink out in California. But the point is, like, those things also don't work. Like, I used to try that. Like, perks, are superficial. Like, the people really want is like an actual connection and an actual like growth and in multiple different dimensions and thoughtfulness. Like, I remember when one of my newly hired colleagues, her husband was diagnosed with cancer, and I dropped everything to try to figure out a way to help. Money, resources, connections, anything. Like, and that became my most important job that day and for a while, because ultimately, that's what family is all about. And if you can get people to be interested in like working here because this is the kind of place that'll do something like that, that's kind of like a different mentality. Because, like, we all have to sort of think about what's important in our own lives. And if something as impersonal as, like, you have a 10,000 person employee company, 10,000 people, you're going to end up having like somebody die on the job or like something like that, and like, how does an organization react to something like that? Like, that's like, oh, we had somebody pass away, or we had, some other really like big event, like a catastrophe, a national catastrophe or something like that. Like, that's, I think, where companies and their culture really change. And it's very hard to build a culture. It's easy to build a company. But it's really, really difficult, I think, to build a company that'll last through ups and downs, and it's not just built to sell real quick or like achieve profitability. Like, really building a place that can survive you and survive the test of time, that's like the hardest thing in the world. And I think that's nirvana that ideally one can achieve, but very, very difficult. Anyway, I think I should probably call it a night. You all have been waiting patiently. I'm really sorry. I could probably speak for forever here, but I have to go handle some small affairs, and I'll make sure to do it again, maybe tomorrow or whenever. So thank you very, very much for your time, and I'll see you guys later.
It's been nice chilling with you, man. Have a nice night.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.